Picture a map of Europe about 50,000 years ago. Thick ice sheets grinding down from the north. Vast open steppes stretching across what is now France and Germany. Temperatures that would make a modern winter feel like a mild afternoon. And scattered across this frozen, wind-battered landscape are people who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew every ridge, every river valley, every cave that could shelter you from a storm that would kill you in hours. They were not our ancestors, and for an extraordinarily long time, they won. Here's the mystery that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Modern humans, our direct ancestors, people who painted caves, carved figurines, built complex social networks, had been in existence for well over 100,000 years before they finally established a permanent presence in Europe. Think about that. We had the tools, we had the intelligence, we had the numbers, and yet Europe, this relatively small peninsula on the western edge of a continent, kept pushing us back, or something in it did. By the way, before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I check every single one. Someone's hearing this on a train in Tokyo at rush hour, someone else is falling asleep in Toronto at midnight. It genuinely never gets old. Now back to that map, because geography here is not just background detail, it's the entire story. Ice Age Europe was not simply cold. It was a different world in almost every measurable way. During glacial peaks, sea levels were dramatically lower. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by a broad plain that is now the bottom of the North Sea. The Mediterranean was smaller and saltier. The Alps and Pyrenees acted like walls that funneled wind and weather in ways that created some of the most brutal living conditions on the planet. Winters lasted longer. Prey animals moved in patterns that took lifetimes to learn. Vegetation cycles were nothing like what modern humans had adapted to in Africa or the Middle East. This wasn't just a cold version of somewhere else. It was genuinely alien terrain to anyone who hadn't grown up in it, and anyone whose parents and grandparents hadn't grown up in it before them. And that is exactly where Neanderthals had the advantage that most people never give them credit for. Forget the hunched, dim-witted brute that shows up in old textbooks. That image has been dead in serious science for decades. The Neanderthals who occupied Europe and Western Asia were cognitively sophisticated, physically extraordinary people who'd been refining their relationship with this specific landscape for somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years. They weren't just surviving the Ice Age, they were, in a very real sense, built for it, adapted to it, embedded in it in ways that a newcomer from warmer latitudes simply was not. So when the first modern humans began probing into Europe, what they encountered wasn't an empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. They walked into someone else's home, a home with 300,000 years of furniture already in place, and for tens of thousands of years those probes largely failed. The archaeological record is frustratingly thin on details, but the broad pattern is clear. Modern humans appeared at the edges of Europe, left a few traces, and then those traces go quiet. No sustained expansion, no permanent foothold. Something was stopping them, or at minimum, something was making success enormously difficult. Was it direct conflict? Competition over caves and hunting grounds? Disease moving between populations that had never shared pathogens? Climate shifts that kept pushing suitable habitat out of reach? Or was it simply that Neanderthals, as master specialists of this particular environment, were consistently better at extracting survival from a landscape that punished every mistake? The honest answer is we don't fully know yet, but what we do know is that the standoff lasted an almost incomprehensible length of time, tens of thousands of years, generation after generation of modern humans reaching toward Europe, and generation after generation of Neanderthals holding on. And then something changed. Not quickly, not cleanly, not in any way that looks like a simple conquest or a sudden victory. But something shifted in the balance between these two groups, and the world that came out the other side was a world that only one of them would inhabit. That's the story we're going to trace, and it starts with understanding what Europe actually looked like before any of us got there. To understand what Neanderthals were defending and what modern humans were trying to enter, you have to understand the Europe that existed before this story reaches its climax, and that Europe was not a single place. It was a shapeshifter, a landscape that could transform so dramatically over thousands of years that a person teleported from one period to another might not recognize they were standing on the same ground. The Middle and Late Pleistocene, roughly from 800,000 years ago up through about 30,000 years ago, was defined by a pulse, a slow, grinding planetary heartbeat. Ice ages advancing, then retreating, glaciers pushing south from Scandinavia, sometimes reaching as far as what is now northern Germany and the British Isles, then pulling back as temperatures warmed and the ice melted into vast river systems, draining towards seas that were themselves constantly rising and falling. This wasn't a single cold snap. Paleoclimatologists have identified at least 8 major glacial cycles during this window, each one reshaping the continent in profound ways. During glacial maxima, the peaks of cold, northern Europe essentially ceased to exist as habitable terrain. The ice sheet was kilometres thick in places. Beneath it, nothing lived. South of the ice, a belt of what scientists call periglacial environment stretched across much of Central Europe. Frozen ground, sparse vegetation, brutal winds driving across open plains with almost nothing to break them. This was mammoth steppe country, cold, dry and treeless for hundreds of miles in every direction. Further south, in refugia along the Mediterranean coast, in sheltered river valleys in what is now France and Spain and Italy, conditions were harsh but survivable. Pockets of woodland, some grassland, enough plant and animal life to support small human populations if those populations knew exactly what they were doing. And then the warm periods, the interglacials, transformed everything again. Forests advanced north. The mammoth steppe shrank. Different animals moved in as the climate softened. The whole ecological map reshuffled. For any species trying to maintain a continuous population across this landscape, it was like trying to stand still on a treadmill that keeps changing speed and direction. The geography added another layer of complexity on top of all this. Europe is not an open plain. It is deeply carved by rivers, interrupted by mountain ranges, and divided in ways that matter enormously when you're a hunter-gatherer trying to move or survive. The Alps run east to west across the middle of the continent like a spine, blocking north-south movement for anyone without the specific skills to navigate high-altitude terrain in winter. The Pyrenees seal off the Iberian Peninsula into something almost like an island, connected to the rest of Europe by only a narrow corridor along the coast. The Carpathians curve through Eastern Europe, funneling movement and creating distinct ecological zones on either side. River systems, the Rhine, the Danube, the Rhone, were not just obstacles. They were highways in good seasons and death traps when they flooded, and their courses shifted over thousands of years as glaciers advanced and melted. What this meant in practice is that Europe was a continent of corridors and dead ends. Some routes between regions stayed passable across many climatic cycles, others opened and closed with the ice. Populations could expand along certain pathways and then find themselves cut off when the climate shifted, trapped in refugia with shrinking resources. This is not a background detail. This geography directly shaped which populations survived, which went extinct, and which eventually spread to repopulate empty territories when conditions improved. It's the same metapopulation logic that governed survival elsewhere, but Europe's specific topography made the game unusually high stakes. Now consider the animals. Because for a hunter-gatherer, the local fauna isn't just food, it's the entire structure of your economy, your technology, your seasonal calendar, your survival. And Ice Age Europe had megafauna that is almost impossible to fully picture from a modern vantage point. Woolly mammoths moved across the open steppe in herds large enough that their passing could be heard from miles away. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed alongside them. Cave lions, larger than any lion alive today, hunted across open ground and into the forests at the margins. Cave hyenas competed with human hunters for carcasses. Cave bears, massive animals that could weigh 500 kilograms, denned in exactly the kind of rock shelters that human hunters also needed for winter survival. Horses and reindeer moved in migrations that, if you understood their patterns, could provide reliable hunting opportunities at predictable times and places. Bison grazed across grassland corridors. Red deer moved through the woodlands during warmer periods. This was an extraordinary abundance of potential food. But potential is the key word. These animals were not easy prey. Mammoths could kill you. Cave lions were actively hunting the same things you were hunting, and occasionally hunting you. The seasonal movements of prey herds required intimate knowledge of local geography, accumulated over years of observation, probably passed down through multiple generations of hunters who had watched the same valleys and the same river crossings season after season. Getting that knowledge wrong didn't mean a bad hunting trip. It meant starvation before spring. Which brings us to the people who had figured all of this out. Neanderthals were not newcomers to this landscape. The archaeological and fossil evidence places their ancestors in Europe somewhere around 400,000 years ago, possibly earlier depending on how you interpret some of the more contested sites. By the time modern humans were first testing the edges of the continent, Neanderthals had been living inside this system of glaciers and megafauna and shifting habitats for hundreds of thousands of years. Their range extended from Britain in the west, across Europe and into Western Asia, reaching as far east as the Altai Mountains in what is now Siberia. Sites from across this range show a consistent pattern of occupation tied to exactly the kinds of sheltered valleys, cave systems, and reliable water sources that any smart hunter would choose. What archaeology can tell us about them is genuinely impressive, and we'll get into the specifics in the next section. But even from the broadest view, the picture is clear. These were not scattered, barely surviving remnants clinging to a marginal existence. Neanderthal sites appear across their range with enough regularity and enough evidence of sustained occupation that we can say with confidence they were the dominant human presence in Europe through most of the Middle and Late Pleistocene. They were not just present, they were established. Here's where we have to be honest about the limits of what we know, because the temptation in a story like this is to paint too clean a picture. The archaeological record is fragmentary in ways that should make anyone cautious. We find Neanderthal sites where conditions happen to preserve bone and stone. We miss everything that happened in places where preservation was poor, in open-air camps, along river margins that flooded and shifted, in forests where organic material decayed completely. The paleo-environmental data, pollen records, sediment cores, isotope analysis from cave deposits gives us increasingly detailed pictures of what the climate was doing at specific times and places, but translating that into precise statements about where populations lived and in what numbers remains genuinely difficult. What we can say is that the broad outlines are solid. Europe during this period was a climatically volatile, geographically complex, ecologically rich continent. It rewarded specialization, punished generalism, and created conditions where deep local knowledge was probably the single most valuable survival asset any human population could possess. The animals were there in abundance. The shelter was there in the form of river valleys and cave systems. The routes for movement existed. But exploiting all of it required understanding that only came from long experience with a specific demanding landscape. Neanderthals had that understanding. They had been building it generation by generation, for longer than modern humans had existed as a species. When the first modern humans began appearing at Europe's edges, somewhere around 120,000 years ago at the earliest, they were stepping into a continent that was already spoken for. Not by some passive occupant that would simply move aside, but by a deeply adapted, cognitively capable, physically formidable human population that had been tested by every climate swing, every extinction pulse, every ecological upheaval the Pleistocene had thrown at them and had come through it. To understand why the newcomers struggled for so long, you first have to understand what exactly they were up against, and that means looking at Neanderthals not as a footnote to our own story, but as the main character in theirs. So who were they exactly? Not the stooped, slack-jawed brutes that Victorian imagination conjured from the first fossil fragments. Not the grunting cave dwellers that populated a century of popular culture. The actual Neanderthals, the ones the fossil record and the genetic evidence and the archaeology are slowly revealing, are far more interesting than any caricature. Their origins trace back to a population moving into Europe somewhere around 400,000 years ago, probably descended from an earlier hominin called Homo heidelbergensis, a wide-ranging species that had already been living across parts of Europe and Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. The populations that pushed north and west into Europe's colder latitudes were entering a crucible, and what came out the other side, after hundreds of thousands of years of selection pressure from ice ages, megafauna, and brutal seasonal swings, was Neanderthals. They weren't a failed experiment. They were a precisely engineered solution to one of the harshest environments any human lineage had ever tried to inhabit. Look at the anatomy, and you see functional engineering, not primitive inadequacy. The Neanderthal body was built for cold and for power. They were shorter on average than most modern humans, but massively built, with bone density and muscle attachment points that suggest a physical robustness we would find extraordinary today. Their barrel-shaped chests and wide hips weren't clumsiness. They were thermal efficiency, a body plan that conserves heat, that keeps vital organs insulated when temperatures drop to dangerous lows. Their limbs were proportionally shorter than those of populations adapted to warm climates, another cold weather adaptation, following the same rule that shows up in Arctic animals and modern human populations from cold regions alike. The face is where the differences become most striking, and where the misinterpretations have done the most damage. Neanderthals had large, projecting mid-faces with enormous nasal passages. For a long time this was read as primitive, as less evolved. The actual explanation is more elegant. Cold, dry air is lethal to lungs. You need to warm it and humidify it before it reaches your airways, and you need to do that fast with every breath, all day, in temperatures that can drop well below freezing for months at a time. Large nasal passages do exactly that job. They're a physiological air conditioning system running in reverse. Their brow ridges were prominent, their jaws were powerful, their teeth show extreme wear patterns consistent with using the mouth as a third hand, gripping hides, processing plant material, working sinew. The face was a tool. Their brains were large, larger, on average, than those of modern humans. This gets quietly glossed over in a lot of popular accounts because it doesn't fit comfortably into a narrative of linear progress toward us. But the evidence is clear. Neanderthal cranial capacity was substantial, in some specimens exceeding modern human averages. The organization of the brain may have differed in ways we can't fully reconstruct, but raw size alone tells you something important about cognitive investment. Now consider how they actually lived, day to day, season to season. The dietary evidence from isotope analysis of their bones is striking. Neanderthals in many regions were eating enormous quantities of large animal protein. Their nitrogen isotope signatures resemble those of top predators. But this wasn't the whole picture. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque on their teeth, has preserved traces of plant material, starchy roots, wild grasses, even evidence of medicinal plants in at least some populations. They were not pure carnivores. They were opportunists who could shift their dietary focus as conditions demanded, hunting heavily when game was abundant, broadening their diet when it wasn't. Their mobility across the landscape was substantial but structured. Stone tools from Neanderthal sites often show raw materials transported dozens, sometimes over 100 kilometers from their geological source. This means movement, trade, or both. They weren't confined to a single valley, waiting for resources to come to them. They tracked prey migrations, moved between seasonal camps, and maintained enough geographic range to buffer themselves against local resource failures. The specific pattern of mobility likely varied by region and by season, mapping onto the movement of prey animals and the shifting availability of plant foods through the year. What makes Neanderthals genuinely remarkable, though, and this is where the evidence forces a reconsideration of everything the old narrative assumed, is what they reveal about social bonds and care. Neanderthal skeletons regularly show healed injuries that would have been debilitating, broken limbs that fused correctly over months of recovery, degenerative joint disease severe enough to have significantly limited mobility, individuals who were effectively disabled and yet survived for years after the injury occurred. You cannot survive as a disabled hunter-gatherer in Ice Age Europe alone. The only explanation is sustained care from others, people who fed someone who couldn't hunt, who protected someone who couldn't move fast enough to escape danger, who kept someone alive through a recovery that offered no immediate return on the investment. That is not instinct. That is something closer to what we would recognize as social obligation. The burial evidence points in the same direction. At sites like Chanedar in Iraq and La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, Neanderthal placed their dead in what appear to be deliberate arrangements. Debate continues about exactly how intentional some of these burials were, and the field is appropriately cautious about overclaiming. But even the most conservative reading of the evidence suggests that Neanderthals treated their dead with something beyond indifference, and they were not uniform. This is the final thing to understand about them, and maybe the most important for what follows. Neanderthals across their range show genuine regional variation. Tool-making traditions differed between Western Europe and the Near East. Site use patterns varied. Dietary emphasis shifted. Some populations show evidence of personal ornamentation, pigment use, eagle talon jewelry. Others don't. They were not a single culture stamped out identically from Portugal to Siberia. They were a collection of regional populations, each shaped by local conditions, each with their own accumulated knowledge and their own particular solutions to the problem of staying alive in a difficult world. That diversity matters, because when modern humans finally began pressing seriously into European territory, they weren't encountering one thing. They were encountering many things spread across a continent those populations had spent hundreds of thousands of years learning to read. To understand what modern humans were up against when they finally began filtering into Neanderthal territory, you have to imagine what home field advantage means when the playing field is an Ice Age continent. In a temperate forest or a lush savanna, you can afford to make mistakes. You can wander a bit, misjudge a water source, arrive a few weeks late for a fruiting season and still recover. In Ice Age Europe, a mistake is something different. Misjudge the wind one night, pick the wrong valley to camp in, misread the migration of one key herd, and it's not just uncomfortable. People die. Children die. Whole groups vanish. Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years learning not to make those particular mistakes in those particular places. Start with the simplest question: where do you sleep? Modern reconstructions love to put Neanderthals in caves, and yes, caves were important. But the crucial thing isn't cave as such, it's microclimate. Not every cave is equal. Some trap cold air like a freezer. Some funnel the wind so that a winter storm turns the entrance into a death zone. Others, usually oriented away from prevailing winds with just the right depth and overhang, are thermally stable havens where the temperature barely budges all year. Knowing the difference is not intuition, it's knowledge. The kind that comes from generations of trial and error, of children growing up hearing stories about which rock face you never camp under in late winter because the thaw sends house-sized slabs of ice crashing down, which riverside ledge is safe until the first big melt and then must be abandoned immediately. Neanderthals didn't just know the big landmarks. They knew the landscape at a fine grain, where a cliff gives shelter from a north wind but creates a deadly eddy when the wind swings around, which shallow basins flood unpredictably when distant snowfields melt, which south-facing slopes will catch enough winter sun to make a difference of a few crucial degrees. These are the kinds of details that never show up on a map, that no first-time visitor can see at a glance, and that matter a lot more when you're sleeping under skins rather than behind insulated walls. Fire is the second half of that shelter calculus. Modern humans arriving from Africa certainly knew how to use fire, but using fire in a generally warm, seasonally wet environment is not the same problem as using it in a place where the air itself can freeze exposed skin in minutes. In Ice Age Europe, fire is not just for cooking and light. It's life support. It has to be started fast in damp conditions, maintained through long nights, protected when the wind shifts, and fueled consistently in landscapes where wood can be scarce or buried under snow. Neanderthal sites show repeated use of particular hearth locations over long intervals. That suggests not only that they could make fire, but that they had mapped where fire behaves well and where it doesn't, where smoke can rise and vent through natural cracks in a rock shelter roof, rather than choking everyone inside, where a hearth can be built against a rock face to act as a heat reflector, warming bodies and drying hides, where a small change in placement prevents a wind gust from showering burning embers across the sleeping area. Fuel itself would have been a learned resource, which dead wood still burns after months of freeze-thaw, which shrubs give hot, fast flames for quick heat, which denser wood is worth hauling back to camp and nursing through an 8-month winter. Maybe even which dried dung or peat layers to dig for when trees are thin on the ground. These are all things you can learn, but you learn them faster, more reliably, when they've already been figured out and folded into tradition. Then there's clothing. The caricature of Neanderthals in ragged skins misses the point again. In a world where the cost of cold exposure is frostbite and pneumonia rather than discomfort, clothing is technology. It's as critical as fire. The archaeological evidence for tailored garments is thin for all Pleistocene humans. Needles and preserved fabrics almost never survive that long. But cut-mark patterns on animal bones, wear patterns on stone tools, and microscopic traces of twisted fibres all point to systematic hide-working and, at least in some regions, the use of plant fibres or sinew as binding. What matters for home advantage is not just that Neanderthals had clothing, it's that their clothing and shelter choices were tuned to this exact climate regime. They knew which animal skins insulate best when wet, which need special treatment to stay flexible, rather than turning into stiff boards, how to layer hides and furs to trap air. They likely knew how to adjust dress for high-exertion hunts versus long static ambushes, how to dry gear effectively in cramped spaces without setting it on fire. Imagine arriving from a continent where you have never needed that level of cold-weather micro-optimization. You can invent it. Humans are clever, but every misstep costs. Every poorly tanned hide that cracks in midwinter, every camp pitched in the wrong wind channel, every fire made with wood that smokes rather than burns is a tiny tax on survival. Now zoom out from the camp to the entire annual cycle, because the true home advantage of Neanderthals wasn't just physical toughness or good caves, it was scheduling. In Ice Age Europe, resources do not just appear, they pulse. Reindeer, bison, wild horses, mammoths, smaller game, salmon runs, seabird nesting colonies, edible bulbs buried in frozen ground, hardy shrubs that leaf out in brief summers, each has its own timing, its own geographic pattern, its own narrow window of abundance. Neanderthals had mapped those calendars onto the land. They knew, for example, when a particular valley would funnel migrating herds each spring because the snow melts earlier there, revealing the first patches of grass. They knew which sheltered ravines hold edible roots longer into the winter because the ground there freezes late and thaws early. They knew that one river bend, and not the one 20 kilometers downstream, consistently traps fish when the water level drops in late summer. Archaeologists talk about logistical mobility and resource scheduling to describe this. But at ground level it's simpler, knowing where to be, when, and with what tools. Move too early and you burn energy waiting for animals that aren't there yet. Move too late and you arrive to find trampled snow and empty tracks. Stay in one place too long and you strip it bare, forcing a desperate relocation in the worst part of winter. Neanderthal groups by necessity would have built yearly rounds, predictable circuits through territories that balanced hunting, plant gathering, shelter availability, and the needs of the most vulnerable members. That balancing act, the decision to leave a place with wood still standing and animals still occasionally visible because you know it will fail in the coming cold, requires long-term memory and shared planning. Risk management in that context is not abstract. It's the difference between a lean year and a mortality event. Exposure is one risk, but it's often not the most immediate. Starvation lurks closer. You can be warm and still slowly die if your scheduling is off, so you diversify. Even top carnivores like Neanderthals appear to have fallback foods. Starchy plants, small game, marrow bones cached from earlier kills, maybe dried meat or fat stored in cold, dark crevices where bacteria struggle. You also manage injury. In a cold, rugged landscape, a broken ankle in November is a potential death sentence, not just for the individual, but for the whole group if that person is a key hunter or caregiver. Neanderthals seem to have compensated with social care and probably with route knowledge, avoiding the most treacherous passes in certain seasons, knowing which ice crossings are stable and which are deceptive, teaching children where not to play, where the slope under fresh snow hides a sheer drop. For a newcomer, all of these are unknowns. The first modern humans to push into Neanderthal range weren't naive hunter-gatherers. They carried their own deep knowledge of African and Near Eastern environments. But knowledge is local. The fact that you understand how to time gazelle migrations in a savanna doesn't automatically translate to predicting reindeer behaviour across patchy snow cover, or reading avalanche risk on a limestone escarpment, or guessing how far sound carries on a still, freezing night when you're trying to stalk wary prey. This is what home advantage really meant. Not that Neanderthals were magically superior, but that they and their ancestors had already paid in failure and death for the information that makes survival less precarious. They knew which mistakes had already been tried and punished. They had stories, customs, taboos. We don't camp there after the first snow. We never cross that river when the ice sounds hollow. We leave this grove untouched because the animals need it in late winter. That encoded generation after generation of brutal lesson. For modern humans arriving from outside, the only way to gain that same granularity of knowledge is to live there long enough, suffer long enough, lose enough people for your own traditions to form. But every failed attempt reduces your capacity to keep trying. A small pioneering band that misreads just a few of those key variables may not get a second winter. So when we talk about early Homo sapiens repeatedly entering Europe and repeatedly failing to hold it, we should imagine less of a dramatic showdown between species and more of a quiet, grinding mismatch between information and environment. On one side, populations whose entire biology and culture had been sculpted to fit this icy, dangerous continent. On the other, newcomers whose skills were impressive but not yet tuned to these particular hazards. The outcome, for a very long time, was predictable. The home team kept winning. If home advantage begins with shelter and scheduling, it cashes out in one brutal arena: getting calories out of other living things before the cold kills you. Neanderthals were not casual foragers who happened to eat meat. In many regions, for long stretches of time, they look more like apex predators sitting very near the top of the food chain. And the way they hunted tells us a lot about what they were good at, what they were willing to risk, and how deeply they understood the animals they depended on. Start with something simple and terrifying: distance. When you imagine prehistoric hunting, it's easy to picture long-range spears arcing gracefully through the air or arrows whistling in from a safe remove. For Neanderthals, especially in classic European sites, that picture is often wrong. The skeletal record is full of clues. Big game animals show impact injuries consistent with heavy thrusting spears driven straight into their bodies at close range. Neanderthal skeletons in turn show a pattern of trauma weirdly similar to modern rodeo riders and professional contact athletes: crushed ribs, broken limbs, spinal damage consistent with being knocked down hard by something big and angry. Interpreting this, most researchers think at least part of Neanderthal hunting involved closing the distance until the animal was near enough to see you, smell you, and trample you. Think about what that implies. You're in deep snow or on slick mud or frozen ground. The air burns your lungs. Ahead of you, a bison or wild horse or reindeer is panicking, twisting, trying to flee. You have to get close enough to drive a heavy wooden spear tipped with stone into its chest or flank, with enough force to penetrate thick hide, muscle, maybe bone. If you miss, there isn't much time to try again. The animal doesn't politely stand there. That kind of hunting is a commitment. It demands not just raw courage, but years of practice and fine-grained teamwork. Someone has to know when to break cover, who circles wide, who stands ready to block an escape route, who waits with the killing thrust. You cannot improvise that on the fly in an Ice Age blizzard. You train for it as a community, with children watching, absorbing, later participating at the safest margins. The tools they used for this were not primitive clubs. Neanderthal stone traditions, especially what archaeologists call the Mousterian, are full of carefully shaped scrapers, points, and flakes, each optimized for a specific slice of the hunting process. Prepared core techniques like Levallois let them strike off flakes of predetermined shape and size. That might sound like a technicality, but it means a hunter could rely on having a predictable standardized point for a spear, or a predictable scraping edge for hide processing, instead of rolling the dice with whatever random shard came off a rock. Hafting, attaching those stone pieces to wooden shafts with sinew and plant resin, was another quiet revolution. A hafted spear point hits harder and penetrates better. A hafted scraper multiplies leverage, letting you remove hide and flesh more efficiently from a carcass, before frostbite or scavengers force you to leave meat on the bones. Neanderthals seem to have mastered these techniques early and used them systematically. Their toolkits weren't just piles of sharp things. They were collections of specialized parts in a well-rehearsed system. But the real constraint in this world isn't just, can you kill something big? It's, can you turn that dead animal into usable calories fast enough and in the right form that it sustains your group through the next lean stretch? A mammoth or bison is a mountain of flesh. Not all of that flesh is equal. Human bodies, especially in cold conditions, run on fat as much as on protein. There's a limit to how much lean meat your liver can process in a day. Go too long on nothing but protein, and you hit what Arctic explorers later called rabbit starvation. Nauseated, weak, and eventually dead despite technically eating. So Neanderthals needed fat. They needed marrow. They needed organ meats and rich deposits of tissue, and they needed to know exactly where on the animal those were, and when in the year they would be most abundant. Cut marks and breakage patterns on bones from Neanderthal sites show obsessive attention to this. Long bones are cracked open systematically to get at the marrow. Joints are disarticulated in consistent ways, suggesting standardized butchery routines passed down over generations. In some sites, you see evidence of what looks like selective transport. They don't carry the whole animal back to camp. They strip and cache or drag only the richest pieces. Heads, limb segments loaded with fat and marrow, spinal sections full of calories per unit weight. Imagine doing that calculus in a blizzard. How many trips can we make before the light dies? Can we risk staying at the kill site overnight when cave lions and hyenas also know this is a food source? Which pieces do we leave for the scavengers because the energy it would take to move them isn't worth what we'd gain? Neanderthals also seem to have known how to preserve those calories. In a world with natural freezers everywhere, you can hang meat in cold, airy spots out of reach of scavengers, or stash bone and fat in crevices that stay just cold enough to slow decay. There are hints of smoking and drying, but even without sophisticated preservation, simply understanding which cuts keep well in the cold and which must be eaten quickly is invaluable. Waste the wrong part at the wrong time, and you're not just being inefficient, you're eroding your buffer against a sudden storm that pins you down for days. All of this only works if your group moves as an integrated unit. Close-range hunting is not something one hero does while everyone else waits at home. It's a choreography built on local knowledge. You have to know exactly which ravine will bottleneck reindeer as they cross from one grazing area to another, which frozen river bend has ice thick enough to support a stampede, which patch of wind-swept ground will be bare of snow early, drawing hungry animals to the first tufts of exposed grass. A Neanderthal band that has hunted the same valley for generations doesn't just see a generic herd. They see patterns. These animals will swing left at that stand of dwarf pine when the wind is from the north. Or, if we spook them right here, half will try to break up slope and hit that hidden ledge. Don't chase. Wait there. Children grow up hearing which slope is best for an ambush in deep snow, which hollow hides dangerous drifts, which stand of trees you never use as cover because the wind curls unpredictably and carries your scent. When modern humans first probed into these landscapes, they brought their own impressive hunting skills. They were likely very good at tracking, at reading animal sign, at using projectiles to wound from a distance. But a projectile advantage can shrink if your prey always has a 200-metre head start because you picked the wrong migration corridor that year, or if you position yourself perfectly for gazelles that never show because the reindeer in this valley take a subtly different path depending on snow crust and wind. Local knowledge shrinks uncertainty. It means your group can risk a high-stakes, close-range attack because you've stacked the odds in your favour. You know the footing under the snow, you know where wounded animals tend to run, you know which routes will leave you upwind the whole time. Outsiders might still succeed now and then, but their failures will be more frequent and more costly. None of this is to say Neanderthal hunting was monolithic, or that every group everywhere hunted the same way. The archaeological record is messy. Some sites show more evidence of scavenging, others of ambush from cover, others of possible use of natural traps like cliffs or bogs. Some researchers argue that Neanderthals may also have used throwing spears, or even simple projectiles in certain environments, especially later in their history. There's variation over time and space, as you'd expect from any flexible, intelligent predator. But the through line across that variability is specialization, an economy and a culture built around high-risk, high-skill exploitation of large game in specific, deeply understood landscapes. They weren't just killing animals, they were running a fine-tuned energy budget in which every successful hunt, every decision at a carcass, every route taken across snow and ice, fed into the same brutal equation. Can we get enough fat, enough marrow, enough safe, storable calories to carry all of us, including the injured, the elderly, the very young, through the next cold push? For tens of thousands of years in Europe, the answer, for them, was yes, often enough to hold the continent. Any newcomer who wanted to displace them wouldn't just need different genes or sharper spears. They'd have to either match or rewrite that entire specialized hunting system, under fire in real time in one of the harshest testing grounds our species has ever known. By the time our lineage was ready to test those Neanderthal strongholds, something important had shifted far away from the snow and spruce of Europe. Back in Africa and the Levant, descendants of that old bottleneck population had been quietly building a different way of being human. More flexible diets, more layered social networks, projectiles that could wound from farther away. Perhaps more elaborate language. None of that guaranteed success in Ice Age Europe, but it did guarantee curiosity. Populations grow, territories fill, even if nobody is consciously thinking, let's conquer Europe. Over generations, edges fray. Young people with no hunting rights in core territories push out into the margins. Droughts or local conflicts make what once felt safe suddenly precarious. To a band squeezed between more powerful neighbours, the windblown steppes to the north might start to look less like a frozen wasteland and more like a risky opportunity. So the first invasions of Europe by Homo sapiens were probably not grand migrations with banners and plans. They were probes, small groups peeling off from larger populations in the Near East, following animal herds, river valleys, or simply rumours of empty land. If you look at a map, there are a few obvious ways into Neanderthal country. One runs along the eastern Mediterranean, up through the Levant, the narrow strip of land that today includes Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. That region has been a contact zone for human species again and again. It's a corridor where African climate patterns brush up against Eurasian ones, where tropical adapted bodies can, in good years, edge into cooler zones without immediately freezing. When Homo sapiens first expanded out of Africa in significant numbers, this is one of the places we almost certainly pass through. Another route comes around the Black Sea and up through Anatolia into what is now Turkey and the Balkans. Think of it as a highland staircase, plateaus and passes where you can move gradually into more temperate, then colder environments. A group that has mastered coastal foraging and open woodland hunting could, step by step, learn to track different animals, read different seasons. Further east there's a huge ancient highway, the steppe belt stretching from Central Asia toward Eastern Europe. Low-rolling grasslands, big herds, terrible winters but generous summers. If your people already know how to hunt on open ground, if you've learned to follow gazelles or wild horses over broad plains, the steppe doesn't feel wholly alien. It's just harsher, leaner, with thinner margins for error. These aren't just lines on a modern atlas, they're ecological funnels. Every corridor narrows at certain points, coastal bottlenecks, mountain passes, river crossings. Any band of modern humans moving through those choke points would have run an evolutionary gauntlet. Food patches thin out. Storms trap you for days. New pathogens lurk in unfamiliar animals and water sources. Neighbouring human groups, Neanderthal or otherwise, might not welcome you at all. If your group is small, one bad winter in a narrow valley ends your entire lineage. If you're larger, you carry more knowledge and more labour, but you also need far more calories, and you move slower. Either way, the landscape is constantly sorting who gets to continue and who quietly disappears. And even if you make it through those bottlenecks, arriving in Europe doesn't mean you suddenly own anything. Picture one of those early Homo sapiens groups finally stepping into a river valley in southeastern Europe that no one in their band has ever seen before. The air is colder, the snow deeper. The stars rise at slightly different angles. The animals they track by instinct back home. Some are here, some are missing. Some behave differently because the seasons hit harder. They might find a cave and use it for a few winters. They leave behind hearths, a scatter of bones, a handful of tools built in the style they learned hundreds of miles away, then a sequence of bad hunts, or a disease ripping through a camp with no immunity, or simply a local Neanderthal band returning to a key hunting ground they have used for generations. Do the newcomers fight and get wiped out? Do they retreat, dribbling survivors back the way they came? Do they get absorbed, a few individuals marrying into Neanderthal groups and disappearing genetically into a far older population? All of those are possible, and archaeologically most of them would look the same, a brief footprint, a layer or two of occupation, and then silence. That's exactly what the early record looks like. Across parts of Greece, the Levant, maybe southern Italy and the Balkans, you see what many researchers interpret as ghost traces of modern humans appearing tens of thousands of years before the big, successful expansion people usually talk about. A layer with slightly different stone tools, a few bones that lean toward a more graceful, Homo sapiens-like anatomy. Charcoal that dates to a warm window when the climate would have allowed subtropical adapted humans to push north a bit. Then, above it, the pattern snaps back to classic Neanderthal material. The tools return to Mousterian styles. The bones, where we have them, are heavy-limbed and cold-adapted again. It's like watching a tentative hand reaching toward Europe and being slapped away by climate, by competition, or both. This is where it's important to separate how we tell migration stories from how migrations actually happen. In a textbook you'll see a clean arrow. Modern humans exit Africa around 60,000 years ago, then spread into Europe around 45,000 years ago. Real life doesn't work like that. Movement is messy, experimental. Bands push forward, hold a little ground, die out, are replaced by another band coming along the same route with slightly different luck or slightly different tricks. Think of waves on a beach, not a single tide line. The first waves of Homo sapiens that lapped against the shores of Europe were small, scattered, easily erased. They didn't build long-lasting settlements that transformed the landscape. They didn't instantly outcompete Neanderthals across entire regions. They arrived, tested the environment, left faint smudges of their presence, and often vanished. The archaeological record, limited as it is, reflects that. You get what look like very short-lived occupations, a layer of ash, a few dozen tools that don't quite match Neanderthal traditions, bones from animals butchered in slightly different ways. They're nothing for thousands of years. Then, somewhere else, a similar thin signal. It's not the roaring, continuous presence you see later with big modern human sites that stack up layers of debris, art, ornaments, and dense burials. It's more like someone tapping on a door from the outside. Not a siege, just knocks, some too soft to hear, some loud enough to be noticed by the people already inside, and that patchiness isn't just about how few sites we've found. It's what you'd expect from repeated forays that fail to establish what ecologists call a self-sustaining population. You can walk into a valley, hunt successfully for a decade, even raise children there. But if your numbers are too low, or you're too dependent on favourable weather, or you keep marrying only within your tiny band, you're always one bad roll away from extinction in that region. To truly arrive in a place like Ice Age Europe, you have to cross an invisible threshold. Enough people, with the right balance of ages and skills, reproducing at a high enough rate that even with occasional crashes, the population recovers locally instead of blinking out. That threshold is hard to hit in a landscape already claimed by another human species that knows every game, trail and cave. So when we talk about the first modern humans in Europe, we shouldn't imagine a single heroic band marching into an empty wilderness and planting a flag. We should think in terms of multiple pulses. A warm climate phase opens a window. Herds shift north. A few Homo sapiens groups follow, graze along the edges of Neanderthal ranges, maybe exchange mates or technologies, maybe clash over a rich valley. Then the climate snaps colder. The window slams shut. The newcomers retreat or die, or are metabolized into the local Neanderthal gene pool. Centuries or millennia later, conditions change again. Another wave rolls in, this time slightly different. Maybe they have more refined projectiles. Maybe their social networks behind them are thicker, sending trickles of new people into the frontier so that when one band fails, another replaces it instead of leaving a vacuum. Maybe they carry new symbolic practices that help bind larger coalitions together. The key is that Europe did not fall to Homo sapiens in one clean sweep. It was tested repeatedly by these early probes, small, fragile, and often unsuccessful. Each wave learned something or died teaching something unspoken to those who would follow. For most of this period, Neanderthals remained the default humans of Europe. They held the good valleys, the known caves, the critical migration choke points. Our ancestors, when they first appeared at the margins, were the experimental ones, the ones gambling with distance and cold, and an enemy they didn't yet fully understand. Only when those tentative waves began to thicken into sustained flows, when enough of our kind could get through the bottlenecks, survive the first brutal winters, and maintain themselves on the land without constant rescue from behind, did the balance of power start to shift. Before that turning point, Europe was not yet ours. It was a continent where our species came knocking again and again, and where, just as often, the answer was no. So why did those early entries fail? Part of the answer is brutally simple math. Imagine one of those pioneering bands of Homo sapiens that made it through the bottlenecks of the Levant and Anatolia and actually crossed into what we'd now call Europe. How many people are we talking about? Not a nation, not a tribe of thousands, maybe 30, 40, 50 individuals, a few extended families tied together by marriage and mutual dependence. That's it. That's the entirety of their presence on a new continent. In ecological terms, that's not a foothold. That's a rumour. With numbers that low, everything is magnified. A broken leg that takes out the group's best hunter. A single winter where the herds migrate just a little farther than expected. A bad run of births, where too many babies die, or too many are born in the same year, overwhelming the band's ability to feed them. Any one of those events can tip a borderline population into a death spiral. Biologists talk about demographic stochasticity. the fancy term for streaks of bad luck in small populations. In a group of millions, weird runs of births and deaths average out. In a group of 30, they don't. If 2 adults of reproductive age die in the same accident, or an illness wipes out half the children, you don't just grieve, you lose your future. Now layer on top of that the very human realities of social strain. A band that size can only absorb so many quarrels over food, leadership or mating before people start walking off, or refusing to cooperate when it matters most. In your home range, you can split and drift into neighbouring valleys where cousins or allies live. On the edge of Neanderthal country, there is no safety net. Drift too far from your few familiar faces, and you are alone in a landscape where every rock, every river, every predator is still a mystery. And those mysteries are not just about weather and game. Every ecosystem comes with its own microscopic defenders. Bacteria, viruses, parasites that have co-evolved with local animals, plants and people for tens of thousands of years. Neanderthals, who had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, weren't just adapted to the cold and the terrain. They were adapted to the local disease environment. The first modern human bands pushing into those same valleys and caves were not. We don't have direct evidence of ancient flu pandemics or specific pathogens that hit newcomers harder. Those things almost never fossilize. But by analogy with every later human migration we can see, it's very likely that disease moved both ways, and that sometimes it did so asymmetrically. A water source that's perfectly safe for a Neanderthal group, because they've been drinking from it for generations, building up immunity to its particular bacterial mix, might hit newcomers with waves of diarrhea and dehydration, just as the temperature drops and food is scarce. A parasite carried by local rodents or ticks might barely bother the locals, but knock the invaders flat during a critical hunting season. You don't need a Hollywood plague for this to matter, a slight increase in childhood mortality. A few more adults weakened during crucial weeks. Over a decade or two in a small, marginal band, that's enough to turn "we might make it" into "we quietly disappear." Then there are hazards that aren't alive at all, but are just as deadly. European winters in the Pleistocene weren't gentle. Sudden thaws and refreezes turned ground into treacherous ice. Rivers that seemed solid could break apart under a loaded hunter. Blizzards could erase trails and landmarks in hours. Neanderthals had generations of accumulated local knowledge about where it was safe to cross, when the ice tended to fail, which slopes tended to avalanche. Modern human newcomers had guesses and analogies from their own homeland. But this valley feels like that valley back home is a very rough guide when a thin crust of snow hides a crevasse, or when the wind shifts and a familiar pattern of animal movement suddenly changes. Under stable climates, you can gradually build that kind of knowledge. Under Ice Age conditions, the climate itself is shifting under your feet. That's another key piece in why early entries often look like one-offs. The Pleistocene wasn't a steady deep freeze, it was a series of oscillations, relatively warm interludes punctuated by cold snaps and brutal downturns. Those warm windows were when Homo sapiens, adapted to somewhat milder environments, could push north. The moment the climate curve bent downward again, the margins they were living on thinned to razor edges. Think about what a small climate downturn means for a struggling pioneer band. Snow that lingers 2 weeks longer in spring. A shorter growing season for the plants that feed the small animals, which in turn feed the bigger game. Calves and fawns born into leaner conditions with higher mortality. A few key herds shift their migration routes by 50 or 100 kilometers to track better forage. For a Neanderthal group deeply embedded in that landscape, those are bad years, but not incomprehensible ones. They know alternate hunting grounds. They have memories of previous bad spells, stories of where to go when the winter that never ends comes around again. For a newcomer population already stretched thin, those little shifts stack. They spend more energy travelling farther, hunts fail more often, stored food runs out sooner, people start taking riskier chances, hunting larger, more dangerous animals or travelling over suspect ice. Injuries go up just as nutrition goes down. The whole system wobbles, and in the background you have competition. Europe was not empty. Its best caves, rock shelters and river crossings were not waiting patiently for Homo sapiens to show up. Neanderthals had occupied many of those prime spots for generations. They knew which caves stayed dry, which ones flooded, which had good airflow for smoke, which ones kept a more stable temperature across seasons. If you are a small band of modern humans arriving in a new valley, the distribution of shelter is not random. The obvious good places are often already claimed. That doesn't have to mean open warfare. It can mean something quieter but equally limiting. Maybe your group is tolerated, at a distance. You're allowed in the valley in summer when resources are abundant, but when winter comes, the core shelters fill with Neanderthal extended families and their allies, and you are the ones camped in the open, on the windward side of the hill, burning more fuel just to stay alive. It can also mean being pushed into suboptimal hunting grounds, the best crossing points where herds predictably funnel through a gorge, already known, already ambushed, already divided up by local groups with long-standing claims. Your hunters are left with the margins, scattered animals on open ground, more energy spent for less return. Over a few years that relative disadvantage compounds. Sometimes there would have been direct conflict, tool marks on bones, spatial separation of sites, and the sheer logic of overlapping territories all suggest that at least some encounters were hostile. A skirmish that leaves half your adult males dead, or key foragers injured, may not show up in the archaeological record as a clear massacre. It just shows up as a site that stops being used. Add all of this together and you get a picture that's less Neanderthals crushed every invader in battle, and more the deck was stacked. Tiny founding populations, no cushion against statistical bad luck. New diseases, unfamiliar parasites, hazardous ice and rockfall patterns you haven't yet mapped in your minds. Climate downturns that hit you harder because you have fewer options and fewer memories of what worked last time. Competition over the best shelters and hunting locales, with the home team starting every season closer to the resources that matter. When we zoom out and look at the timeline, we see pulses of Homo sapiens presence that bloom and fade. For each, we can propose stories. Maybe this group was undone by a sudden cold snap. Maybe that one succumbed to an epidemic they picked up from local animals. Maybe another was gradually squeezed off key water sources by Neanderthal neighbours until they simply couldn't sustain births above deaths. But the honest answer is, we don't know the precise cause for any particular failure. What we do know is that all of these factors, demographic fragility, disease, hazards, climate, competition, are the kinds of things that routinely prune small, isolated populations in both human and non-human species. In that sense, it would be more surprising if the first few waves of Homo sapiens into Europe had succeeded than that they mostly failed. And yet, they kept coming. Every failed pulse left something behind. A trick of working bone or stone that impressed a neighbour, a word borrowed, a mating that smuggled a few new genes into a Neanderthal lineage. Every lost band also helped define, however indirectly, what it would take to survive here. Because eventually, one of those waves would cross that invisible threshold. Enough people, enough knowledge, enough resilience to withstand the bad winters and the unlucky years. When that happened, Europe stopped being a frontier tested by brief experiments and started becoming a contested home. That moment, when failure rates dropped and persistence began, is where the story shifts from scattered probes to sustained contact. It's where Neanderthals and modern humans stopped being distant shadows to each other and started living, hunting, and sometimes dying in the same landscapes side by side. That's where we turn next, to the contact zones, and what uneasy coexistence between two human species might actually have looked like. So what does that actually look like on the ground? Not a documentary reenactment with neat labelled tribes lining up across a valley. More like a messy, shifting patchwork of zones where two kinds of humans were aware of each other, sometimes in direct contact, sometimes only as rumours and traces. Archaeologists talk about overlap as if it were a simple thing. In reality, it's maddeningly hard to pin down. In some regions, we see layers of classic Neanderthal tools, Mousterian industries, followed closely in time by layers of early Homo sapiens tools with very different styles. Sometimes they're in the same cave, separated by just a thin band of sediment. Sometimes they're in neighbouring sites along the same river. Did that mean they were there at the same time, taking turns in the same shelters with a kind of seasonal timeshare? Maybe. Or it might mean Neanderthals used a cave for generations, abandoned it for a few decades when game routes shifted, and a modern human group wandered in later, never actually meeting their predecessors. Radiocarbon dating gets us close, but not close enough to say, these two occupations overlap by 20 years, therefore they definitely met. The error bars can be bigger than a human lifespan. At that scale, almost certainly passed within a day of each other, and missed each other by 5 generations blur together. Still, when you zoom out, patterns emerge. There are regions, especially in parts of the Levant, in southeastern Europe, and later in western Eurasia, where Neanderthal and Homo sapiens signatures interleave over thousands of years. Not a single replacement event, a braid. Neanderthal tools, then modern tools, then Neanderthal-like tools again, or hybrid-looking assemblages that don't fit cleanly in either box. Those places were probably contact zones. In a contact zone, daily life is built around decisions about distance. Most of the time, the default strategy for two closely matched predators is simple. Avoid each other. Wolves and lions don't constantly fight. They adjust their ranges, scent-mark territory, and shift hunting times to minimize direct clashes. It's cheaper to move over a ridge than to lose half your hunting party in a brawl. Hominins weren't any different. Imagine you're part of a modern human band that's finally getting some traction in a marginal European valley. You know, from stories and from occasional distant sightings, that another human species uses the same river. You've seen their footprints in the mud, larger and broader than yours. You've stumbled on a fresh kill, butchered with tools that cut in a slightly different way than the blades your people make. Do you walk up and introduce yourself? Probably not. You shift your camp location to a side valley. You alter your hunting times. Maybe you take advantage of their kills when they're not around, snatching scraps from abandoned carcasses. They're doing similar calculations. Each group watches smoke on the horizon, listens for unfamiliar voices on the wind, and quietly adjusts. But avoidance isn't the whole story. Some evidence hints at something more complicated. Not just fleeing each other, but sometimes seeking each other out. In certain layers from Central and Western Europe, archaeologists find ornaments, shell beads, animal teeth, carved pieces of bone and ivory that look stylistically like they belong to Homo sapiens cultures, yet they turn up in sites that otherwise look Neanderthal. Is that imitation, trade, shared camps? We can't be sure. What it does suggest is that ideas and probably objects moved across whatever social boundary separated these two groups. You don't accidentally converge on the same complex bead-making technique by chance. Somebody saw something, valued it, and copied it, or acquired it. Now picture a different kind of encounter. Two small hunting parties on opposite sides of a river. They see each other. They shout, if not in anything we'd recognize as language, then in structured calls, gestures, signals. Spears are visible but not raised. Nobody wants to risk a direct clash. The stakes are too high. A serious fight here doesn't just mean a few casualties. It could mean your whole band goes hungry for weeks because half your skilled hunters are dead or wounded. So you posture, you show strength, you wave people forward, then back. You maybe throw a few stones into the river, a warning. Then, slowly, you drift apart, each side retreating with their own stories about the strange people across the water. Over time, though, that caution can erode, at least in some places, for some individuals, because there are also the intimate traces, DNA signatures that don't lie. We know there was interbreeding. That means at least occasionally someone crossed that line of wariness. How does that even happen? One route is through violence, abductions, raids, forced matings. Humans have done this to other human groups throughout history. There's no reason to think Ice Age hominins were immune to the darker possibilities. But the genetic patterns we see, multiple episodes of admixture spread over tens of thousands of years, hint at something more varied than one-sided brutality. You don't get repeated gene flow from a single catastrophic event. You get a patchwork of individual relationships, some ugly, some probably negotiated, some maybe even consensual across generations. Think about the logic of marriage alliances among small-scale societies. If Band A and Band B keep bumping up against each other in the same valley, raiding each other's kills, occasionally squabbling at waterholes, there's a point where a different strategy becomes attractive. What if one of our daughters goes to live with them? What if one of their sons joins us? We'd be foolish to project modern ethnic boundaries backward intact. But the general principle holds. Exchanging mates is a powerful way to reduce tension and create shared interest. Once you have a niece or grandson living with the other group, them and us start to blend at the edges. The archaeological record, fragmentary as it is, hints at this kind of uneasy blending in the contact zones. In some late Neanderthal sites, you see shifts in stone tool traditions, points and blades that look more like the ones Homo sapiens were using nearby. In some early Homo sapiens sites, You find robust, Neanderthal-like features in bones and teeth, or tool choices that seem conservative in ways more typical of Neanderthal cultures. It's not a clean swap, it's a gradient. Territory sits at the heart of all this. In an Ice Age environment, land isn't just land. A narrow gorge with a predictable reindeer migration route is survival. A particular spring that never freezes, a south-facing limestone overhang that stays dry in winter. These are the difference between scraping by and thriving. Neanderthals had long-standing relationships with these spots. They weren't wandering randomly. Over hundreds of generations, they'd built up mental maps of our winter shelter, our summer hunting ground, that cave where we only stay 2 nights because the roof sometimes throws rocks. When Homo sapiens arrived with their own, much sketchier maps, every decision about where to camp, where to hunt, where to move in a bad year pressed up against this invisible web of claims. Territoriality among humans is rarely absolute. It's negotiated through behaviour, ritual, and crucially, through cultural signalling. This is where ornaments, body decoration, and style come in. When you see an explosion of personal adornment, shell beads, pierced teeth, carved pendants, distinctive ways of napping stone or shaping bone, right around the time when 2 human species begin overlapping, that's probably not a coincidence. These things aren't just pretty, they're badges. In a world where you might run into those other people at a distance in a foggy valley, it helps if you can tell at a glance, friend, stranger, or enemy. Shared ornament styles say, we are us. They also say, we are not them. If Neanderthal groups and modern human bands were occupying neighbouring territories, they were probably reading each other's signals with intense attention. A band on the horizon, with familiar ornaments and tool styles. Maybe those are the neighbours you sometimes trade with or at least tolerate. A band with alien styles, wearing bones and shells in arrangements you've never seen. That's dangerous. You tighten your grips on your spears. We can even imagine a boundary zone where styles deliberately diverge, where Homo sapiens begin emphasizing certain bead arrangements, colours, or carved motifs precisely to differentiate themselves from Neanderthal neighbours, and vice versa. It's an arms race not of weapons, but of identity. So, was coexistence peaceful? Sometimes, maybe. There could have been valleys where Neanderthal and modern human bands developed a stable rhythm, different hunting seasons, agreed no-go zones, occasional exchange of materials or partners, an uneasy truce held together by mutual need and the high cost of open conflict. There were almost certainly other places where it went the opposite way, where one group ambushed the other at a key pass, wiped out a band and took over their shelter, where a particularly aggressive lineage pushed neighbours steadily back until their birth rates collapsed. And in between those extremes there were probably 1,000 local stories we'll never recover. Children with mixed ancestry wandering back and forth between camps. Hunters from different species wordlessly cooperating to finish off a dangerous animal and then fighting over the carcass. Nights when stories were told around separate fires about the strange people in the next valley. Stories that exaggerated, demonized, or romanticized them. The evidence we have, scattered tools, bones, ornaments, overlapping dates, and genetic traces, doesn't resolve into one clean narrative. It resists it. That's important. Because when we talk about contact between Neanderthals and modern humans, it's tempting to reach for a single story, noble trade partners, or brutal conquerors, or tragic star-crossed species. The reality was almost certainly all of the above, depending on when and where you look. What we can say is that for tens of thousands of years, Europe was not a simple battlefield, and not yet anyone's uncontested homeland. It was a mosaic of contact zones, rivers, passes, coasts, and valleys, where 2 different kinds of humans navigated a constant tension between competition, curiosity, fear, and need. Into that already complex landscape, something else was pressing in from above, the climate. Because while Neanderthals and modern humans were watching each other, the ice and the forests were still shifting, and the way that long environmental squeeze played out would tilt the balance of this uneasy coexistence in ways neither species could possibly foresee. If the contact zones are the surface story, genes are the deep record. Because in a way, your body is carrying notes from those meetings, scribbled in a language most of us can't read, but that geneticists are slowly learning to translate. Start with the headline fact. If you have ancestry from outside sub-Saharan Africa, you almost certainly carry Neanderthal DNA. Not a lot, on average, about 1–2% of your genome, but not nothing either. And across all living humans combined, if you add up all the different Neanderthal fragments scattered in different people, we're collectively preserving maybe 30–40% of the Neanderthal genome. That alone tells us something huge. Neanderthals didn't just vanish without a trace. They didn't stay locked behind some absolute reproductive barrier. They were close enough to us, biologically, that when they and Homo sapiens shared space, some of their children survived and had children of their own, often enough that the echoes are still detectable tens of thousands of years later. But those echoes aren't spread evenly. They're patchy, both in geography and in the genome itself. East Asians, for example, tend to carry slightly more Neanderthal DNA on average than Europeans. People from Oceania carry a different archaic signal on top of that, from Denisovans. Some African populations have very little Neanderthal ancestry. Others have small amounts that likely came back into Africa later through returning Eurasian lineages. And then within any one person's genome, Neanderthal segments are concentrated in some regions and conspicuously missing from others. There are deserts, stretches of DNA where, across thousands of sequenced individuals, Neanderthal ancestry is almost completely absent. That pattern is our first clue that these meetings were not just a one-off accident. You don't get that kind of complex patchwork from a single night of contact somewhere in the Levant. You get it from multiple pulses of interbreeding in different places and times, followed by long periods where natural selection pruned some of those archaic genes and preserved others. So when did it happen? Here's where it gets tricky, because genes don't come with timestamps stamped on them. Geneticists have to infer timing indirectly. One method looks at the length of Neanderthal DNA segments. When two populations mix, the first generation of children inherits big, unbroken chunks of DNA from each side. Each generation after that, recombination chops those chunks into smaller pieces. The more generations that pass, the shorter, on average, those archaic fragments become. By measuring how long those Neanderthal segments are in living people, and plugging that into models of how fast recombination shuffles DNA, researchers can estimate when the mixing probably happened. Most studies point to major introgression events roughly 50–60,000 years ago, likely soon after the first major wave of Homo sapiens left Africa and encountered Neanderthals in the Near East and surrounding regions. But there are also signals of later and possibly earlier contacts, minor pulses of gene flow that don't all fit neatly into one date. And because all of this depends on assumptions about generation time, about population sizes, about mutation rates, there are error bars. We're not talking on a Tuesday in April 54,327 years ago. We're talking broad windows, sometime in this several thousand-year span, in a population that looked roughly like this. Still, even with those uncertainties, a picture emerges. Our ancestors didn't just meet Neanderthals once, have a brief period of mixing and then separate forever. They seem to have run into each other again and again as Homo sapiens bands pushed into new regions. Each time, a few more genes crossed the species boundary. But here's the crucial part. Most of those genes didn't stick. If Neanderthals contributed, say, 5–10% of the DNA of some early Eurasian groups, why do we only see 1–2% today? Because evolution edited the encounter. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had children together, those children inherited entire packages of Neanderthal genes designed by hundreds of thousands of years of selection for Neanderthal bodies and Neanderthal lifestyles. Some of those genes happened to work well in hybrid descendants, others did not. Over thousands of generations, slightly harmful Neanderthal variants quietly reduced the reproductive success of people who carried them. Not catastrophically, rarely in a way any individual would notice, but just enough that statistically those lineages left fewer descendants. Bit by bit, natural selection shaved down the archaic contribution. That's why we see those Neanderthal-free deserts in modern genomes, especially around genes involved in things like testes function, egg development, and early embryonic growth. Hybrids whose reproductive systems used mismatched Neanderthal variants were probably less fertile. Their genes, including those particular Neanderthal fragments, didn't spread as effectively, so the meeting between species wasn't a simple genetic merger, it was more like a sieve. But some Neanderthal genes did the opposite. They surged. In immunology genes, those involved in recognizing and fighting pathogens, we see the telltale signs of positive selection, Neanderthal variants that spread faster than chance, becoming common in particular regions. Think about what that means on the ground. When Homo sapiens moved into Eurasia, they weren't just facing new climates and unfamiliar animals. They were walking into an immunological minefield of new parasites, bacteria, and viruses. Neanderthals had been dealing with those threats for hundreds of thousands of years. Their immune systems had been shaped by that particular ecosystem. So a Homo sapiens child who happened to inherit Neanderthal versions of certain immune genes might have had a real advantage. Fewer infections in childhood, better survival during epidemics, slightly higher odds that their own children would live. Natural selection loves that kind of edge. We see similar stories in other traits. A Neanderthal-derived variant in modern Tibetans helps with life at high altitude by tweaking how the body handles hypoxia. Some Neanderthal alleles seem tied to skin and hair biology, influencing how our bodies deal with UV light and temperature in northern latitudes. These are not massive superpowers, they're nudges. But stacked over many generations, nudges can reshape entire populations. So what does all this tell us about the social side of contact? Less than we might like. Genes can tell us that interbreeding happened, roughly when it happened, and which bits of DNA we kept or discarded. They can hint at whether hybrids were common enough to leave a mark and whether they were fully fertile. They cannot tell us if those first hybrids were cherished or shunned. They cannot distinguish, in any straightforward way, between a child born of a negotiated marriage alliance and a child born of a raid. They can't show us fear or tenderness or resentment. Even the patterns we sometimes use as hints, like an apparent bias toward Neanderthal ancestry, coming through maternal or paternal lines, are murky. Early claims that we only see Neanderthal DNA from Neanderthal fathers and human mothers, for instance, have been complicated by newer data and alternative explanations involving selection and drift. When scientists talk about reduced Neanderthal ancestry on the X chromosome, some people jump straight to a social story. Maybe Neanderthal males and modern human females were common pairs, but the reverse wasn't. It's a tempting leap. But that same pattern can also emerge simply because harmful recessive mutations have a different impact on sex chromosomes than on autosomes. Biology, not behaviour, may be doing most of the explaining, so we have to be disciplined. The genetic record shows multiple episodes of mixing, not just one. Hybrids that were viable and often fertile, a long process of selection where some Neanderthal traits helped and spread, while many others slowly faded. Everything above that, whether those encounters happened mostly in stolen moments on the edge of raids, or in carefully negotiated exchanges of mates, or in long-term blended communities, is still largely invisible to DNA. We know there were meetings. We know those meetings mattered enough that your own cells still carry their consequences. We know they were messy because evolution's cleanup is still written across our genomes in scars and seams. But genes are only one layer of the story. Above them, shaping who met whom, who lived where, and which mixed children had a chance to grow up, was something bigger and more impersonal than any individual romance or raid. The environment itself, changing on a scale that neither Neanderthals nor Homo sapiens could control. And as the ice sheets advanced and retreated, as forests thickened and then thinned into steppe, that slow, grinding pressure started to tilt the odds in a way that would eventually decide who stayed in Europe and who did not. From a distance, the Ice Age looks simple. You see those classic textbook maps, big white ice sheets sitting on northern Europe, arrows showing glacial maximum, maybe a diagram of a mammoth on a snowy plain. It feels static, frozen. Like Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens were just two teams playing out a single long battle on the same icy field. But that's an illusion. Zoom into the timescale that matters for living things, hundreds of years, thousands at most, and the Ice Age stops being a fixed backdrop and turns into a strobe light. On-off, hot-cold, wet-dry, forest to tundra and back again. Not once, not twice, over and over. Climate scientists call these swings stadials and interstadials, and behind them are even sharper pulses. Dansgaard-Oeschger events, Heinrich events. Abrupt shifts recorded in Greenland ice cores and North Atlantic sediments. On paper, it all sounds technical. On the ground, for Neanderthals, it meant this. The world you trained your children to survive in could be gone before your grandchildren were born. Imagine you grow up in a Europe where the glaciers are pulled back. Summers are short but tolerable. Mixed conifer and deciduous forests spread over hills and valleys. You and your band know how to stalk red deer in dense undergrowth, how to ambush wild boar at forest edges, how to read the patterns of rivers that never freeze solid. Then, over a few human lifetimes, the dial turns. Winters get longer, summers are colder and drier, trees start dying back, forests thin into patchwork. In some places they vanish altogether, replaced by open steppe, grasslands dotted with low shrubs, windswept and exposed. The animals change with the plants. The nimble forest deer and boar you grew up hunting withdraw or vanish from your region. In their place, herds of steppe bison, wild horses, maybe saiga antelope and woolly mammoths dominate the landscape. They move differently. They see you coming from farther away. They require new tactics, new tools, new cooperation patterns to bring down. If this happened once, a flexible hunting people could adapt, but it didn't happen once. Throughout the crucial window when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens overlapped in Eurasia, roughly between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, Europe's climate didn't just trend colder toward the last glacial maximum, it oscillated, repeatedly, sometimes brutally fast on ecological timescales: forest, steppe, back to forest, wet, then arid, rivers carving new channels, lakes forming and drying up, habitats expanding, fragmenting, reassembling in new configurations. And that reshuffling matters, especially if you are already a small scattered population. Think back to that meta-population structure we talked about before. Little bands of 20 or 30 people separated by long distances, linked by kinship and occasional exchanges. That setup is great for buffering against one local disaster. If a valley floods, or a disease sweeps through one cluster, others survive elsewhere. But it comes with a catch. When the environment becomes patchy, when good habitat breaks into isolated pockets like islands in a sea of bad country, those little bands suddenly live on shrinking archipelagos. Biologists call this habitat fragmentation, and it's one of the most reliable ways to push already vulnerable species toward the edge. In a stable climate, Neanderthal groups might have maintained a rough balance. Some patches of prime habitat here, marginal ones there, people moving, splitting, merging as game and seasons demanded. Cultural knowledge, where to find flint, where herds migrate, which valleys hold water longest in dry years, could be passed along and updated gradually. But in a Europe of fast oscillations, that knowledge decayed quickly. The wintering ground your grandparents swore by might now be a treeless, wind-swept plateau. The river crossing your group used for generations might sit under seasonal ice most of the year, or be braided into channels you don't recognize. Plants you relied on for medicine might retreat hundreds of kilometers south with the shifting climate zones. Every major climate downturn, every rapid shift from relatively mild interstadial to harsh stadial conditions effectively smashed the European landscape into a new puzzle. Woodland corridors that once allowed Neanderthal bands to move, trade, and find mates could break up into isolated pockets, separated by open, dangerous steppe or expanding ice. For a species that seems to have been strongly tied to particular kinds of environments, especially forested and mixed environments rich in certain large mammals, that's a problem. Neanderthals were not helpless generalists bumbling around the landscape. They were specialists. Ice Age Europe was their home turf. Over hundreds of thousands of years they had tuned their bodies and their cultures to the ecological rhythms of this continent. But specialization bites both ways. In the warmer interglacials and milder phases, Neanderthals appear to have focused heavily on a slim set of large mammals, big herbivores like red deer, bison, horses, sometimes rhinoceros or mammoth, depending on region and period. Their tools, their cooperative hunting strategies, even their seasonal movements seem optimized for those prey. When the big game community itself changed, the game board changed with it. Megafauna are not all the same from a hunter's perspective. A red deer is not a reindeer, is not a steppe bison. They differ in wariness, speed, herding behaviour, habitat preference. Tactics that work in broken woodland, driving deer into bottlenecks, ambushing them near concealed approaches, don't translate directly to wide-open tundra, where herds can spot you from a kilometre away. As glacial conditions intensified, some classic Neanderthal prey shrank in range or shifted latitude. Cold-adapted species moved in. Mammoths and woolly rhinos might look like a bonanza of meat and fat, but they are also extremely dangerous and require very different risk calculations than mid-sized deer. Reindeer and saiga antelope migrate over vast distances. Track them poorly, and you can find yourself in an empty valley at the worst possible season. Each of these transitions demanded cultural flexibility, new knowledge, new tracking techniques, perhaps new sharing rules within and between bands to smooth out feast-famine cycles. And every time Neanderthals figured out a strategy for one configuration of climate, plants and prey, the climate roulette wheel spun again. Now layer on top of that the demographics. Neanderthal populations were never large. Genetic evidence points to long-term low effective population sizes and signs of inbreeding in some lineages, even before Homo sapiens appears on the scene. That means each band had limited brain copies to store information, limited learners to experiment with new ways of doing things, and limited redundancy when disaster hit. When a rapid cold plunge ripped through Europe and forest contracted southward, many Neanderthal groups in the north and centre of the continent likely faced a stark choice: move, adapt, or die. The archaeological record suggests that, in many of these crises, Neanderthals retreated into refugia, regional pockets where local climate, topography, and oceanic influences softened the blow. Southern France, the Iberian Peninsula, parts of Italy, the Balkans, maybe the Crimean region, places where temperate trees clung on in sheltered valleys, where rivers stayed liquid a bit longer, where big game could still find enough to eat. Refugia are double-edged too. On one hand, they're safe harbours. Populations survive there while conditions wipe out or severely reduce groups living in more exposed regions. On the other, they're bottlenecks. They compress multiple bands into smaller areas, increasing competition for local resources and making it harder to maintain long-distance networks. Every time Neanderthals were pushed into refugia by a climate downturn, their continental range probably shrank, then re-expanded when things warmed up enough. Each cycle pruned lineages. Some bands that failed to reach or thrive in those refuges simply disappeared from the gene pool. Over tens of thousands of years, you can think of Neanderthal history in Europe as a series of these contractions and expansions, like lungs breathing under a weight that gets gradually heavier. With each breath, the overall population may have thinned, fewer groups recolonizing fewer territories, with more gaps in between, and all the while, the megafauna matrix they relied on was shifting too. Some large mammals that had been part of Neanderthal economies earlier in the Middle Pleistocene declined or vanished. Others surged and then later crashed. Predator guilds changed, competition with wolves, lions and hyenas waxed and waned as prey densities fluctuated. Scavenging opportunities might spike after an especially hard winter, then vanish again when herbivore numbers dipped too low. For a specialist hunter, these are not abstract background changes. They determine whether your children eat. Modern humans coming out of Africa brought their own package of risks and advantages into this oscillating world, but one likely edge was broader ecological plasticity, a willingness, forced by earlier crises, to use a wider range of foods, from small game to fish and plant resources, and to build dense social networks that could smooth out local boom-bust cycles. Put that against Neanderthals trying to ride out yet another swing into colder, more fragmented conditions, geography shoving them back into southern and western refuges, and you start to see the imbalance. But it's crucial not to turn climate into a lazy one-line explanation. Neanderthals had already survived multiple glacial cycles before Homo sapiens ever set foot in Europe. They were not fragile victims instantly swept away by the first serious cold snap. In many regions, they weathered previous climate crises remarkably well. So when we talk about the long crisis of climate and habitat, we're not saying that the weather killed the Neanderthals and that's the end of it. What we're looking at is a long, grinding process where rapid climate oscillations fragmented their world, shrank and reshaped their habitats, and repeatedly forced them into refugia. Each pulse chipped away at their numbers, their connectivity, and their ability to reinvent themselves fast enough when prey and plants and landscapes changed under their feet. Climate set the stage, it loaded the dice, but it didn't roll them alone. Into this unstable, patchwork Europe walked another human species, carrying different technologies, different social wiring, and its own lessons from a much older climate catastrophe. And as the environmental pressure ratcheted up, those differences started to matter more and more. To see how, we have to look at what came next. A burst of innovation and networking that changed not just who could survive in Europe's shattered habitats, but how. When archaeologists talk about the Aurignacian, or initial Upper Paleolithic, it can sound like a boring label in a museum case. What they're really talking about is a change in how humans thought about problems. By the time Homo sapiens shows up across Europe in force, after those first failed probes, after the back and forth of early contact zones, you start to see something new in the ground. Not one magic invention, not a single smart gene, a package, diverse toolkits, broader networks, deeper planning. Think about the classic Neanderthal toolkit in its heyday. Highly effective, regionally tuned, centered on robust, multi-purpose stone tools and powerful thrusting spears. It worked. It worked for hundreds of thousands of years in environments most of us would not survive a week in. But when you sift through the layers from later Homo sapiens sites, especially from around 45,000 years ago onward, you notice a different pattern. Instead of a few dominant tool types tuned to a narrow range of tasks, you start seeing an explosion of variation. Long, standardized blades struck from carefully prepared cores. Tiny bladelets that could be inserted into wooden or bone shafts to make composite tools. Specialized scrapers, barons, perforators, awls. Bone points and antler spearheads that could flex instead of shattering. Needles with eyes. Each piece is doing a more specific job. That shift matters because it changes what a group can do when the world flips on them. A toolkit full of generalized, heavy-duty implements is fantastic when you're locked into a known prey set and a stable seasonal rhythm. You know the hunts, you know the routes, your tools reflect that focus. A toolkit packed with modular, specialized parts is more like a box of interchangeable components. You can recombine them to meet new tasks. Different prey, different plants, different raw materials. You can scale up or down, big projectiles for big game, finer tips and traps for birds, fish and small mammals when large herds thin out. In a Europe that kept slamming from forest to steppe and back again, that kind of flexibility became a survival strategy in its own right. And the tool diversity isn't just about hunting. Bone and antler technology hints at clothing that fits more closely. Maybe layered garments, maybe tailored hoods or mittens. Needles mean stitching. Stitching means you can trap warm air, stay mobile longer in colder winds, push into marginal terrain that would freeze you out otherwise. Suddenly, where we can live is not only dictated by the nearest patch of mild microclimate. Clothing and shelter tech create artificial microclimates you carry on your back. That feeds into the next piece of the package, planning depth. When you read an archaeological site as a living space instead of a scatter of artifacts, you start to see calendars written in stone and bone. At many later Homo sapiens sites in Europe and Western Asia, you find evidence that people weren't just reacting to whatever showed up that week. They were scheduling. There are layers that suggest seasonal base camps, places groups return to year after year to exploit particular runs of salmon, migrations of reindeer, or seasonal plant resources. You see storage pits and evidence of intensive processing. Bones smashed not just for meat, but systematically for marrow and fat. Grease rendered from spongy bone, meat dried or smoked. Storage is a quiet revolution. If you can turn a few days of extraordinary luck, a herd driven into a ravine, a stranded whale, a massive autumn kill, into food that lasts months, you break the tyranny of the immediate hunt. You're less likely to starve when herds shift or a blizzard pins you in place. But storage only pays off if you can protect it and coordinate around it. That's where planning depth becomes social. You need agreements about who can access stored food, who guards it, who gets invited in when things go bad. You need to remember where caches are over long distances and long gaps. You need to coordinate hunting season so you don't strip an area bare and then arrive next year to find nothing left. Mobility changes too. Neanderthals were mobile. There's no question about that. They moved to track prey and raw materials, shifting home ranges with the seasons. But in many regions, their patterns look like tight regional rounds centered on favored landscapes. Later, Homo sapiens groups often seem to be playing on a larger board. Raw materials, high-quality flints, exotic shells, specific pigments move hundreds of kilometers from their sources. Tool styles and decorative traditions pop up over vast regions almost simultaneously. That suggests not just individuals wandering far, but structured, long-distance networks of contact. Think of a band that spends part of the year in one river system, part in another, but maintains ritual meetups with partners from valleys they may not visit themselves. Now scale that up. News, mates, and ideas can travel far beyond any one group's annual circuit. Why does that matter in a patchwork Europe? Because long-distance connections are a hedge against bad luck. If your valley's herds crashed this year because an ice storm glazed the ground, but your trading partners 200 kilometers away had a mild winter, a pre-existing relationship can mean the difference between starvation and survival. When food and information flow through networks, instead of stopping at the edge of each band's territory, local famines don't have to turn into population collapses. And these aren't just dry economic links. They're glued together with meaning. This is where symbolic items come in, not as primitive art for art's sake, but as social technology. Across many early Homo sapiens sites in Europe and Africa, you find personal ornaments, pierced animal teeth, beads made from shells carried inland from coasts no one is living on, carved bone pendants, carefully applied ochre on skin, hair, or objects. On their own, a shell bead is not going to feed you or keep you warm, but a string of beads that marks you as someone's cousin, ally, or member of a particular exchange network can. Symbolic systems, shared styles, colours, motifs, are like ancient ID cards and membership badges. They tell strangers, I am part of the same story as you, or we have a deal through so-and-so's kin. Even simple marks, repeated geometric patterns on bone, consistent designs on tools, can function as mnemonic devices, reminders of stories, rules, or obligations. They let social information travel with the object, not just with the person who made it. Language almost certainly underpins this, but the archaeological record catches the physical residue, the tokens of promises, the wearable advertisements of who you are connected to. When you combine that with longer distance mobility and more varied subsistence, you get something potent. Regional networks that can absorb shocks. A drought in one microregion can be mitigated by moving, by drawing on stored foods, by calling in favours from distant partners who recognise your beads and your stories. A sudden cold pulse that wipes out one migration path doesn't automatically wipe out every route to help. It's important to be clear. This doesn't mean Neanderthals had no symbols, no planning, no social glue. They clearly did. Burials with apparent care, possible pigments, incised bones that might represent notches or marks with meaning, evidence of repeated use of particular locales over long spans. They were thinking beings, not half-finished humans. The difference we see in the later period is less about presence versus absence, and more about scale and spread. Neanderthal symbolic practices, as far as we can see, seem patchy, local, sometimes fleeting, deep in one region or time slice, thin in another. Their raw material movement is often impressive but still mostly regional. Their tool traditions are highly adapted but typically narrower in range. The Homo sapiens pattern, in contrast, looks like symbolic and technological systems that can stretch across entire subcontinents. Styles of beads, forms of blades, ways of shaping bone tools appear in site after site over huge distances and persist long enough to evolve regional variants. In a stable world, this difference in network scale might be interesting but not decisive. In a Europe lurching between ecological states with refugia shrinking and expanding like lungs, it becomes a kind of armour. If your survival strategy depends mainly on your immediate surroundings and a small circle of neighbouring bands, each climate punch hits you almost directly. Lose a valley, lose a band, and a whole branch of knowledge dies with them. If your survival strategy is embedded in an information web that stretches from one end of a continent to the other, you can lose nodes, entire communities, and the system still holds. Ideas, genes, and aid can root around damage. So when we talk about new tools, new networks coming into Europe with Homo sapiens, we're really talking about a different way of being human in a dangerous world. More specialized, more modular technologies, storage and scheduling that turn luck into security, mobility patterns that treat the landscape like overlapping territories instead of isolated islands, symbolic systems that bind distant strangers into recognizable us. All of that sits on top of the same bottleneck-forged brain that Neanderthals shared. Big, social, capable, but configured differently. And as climate pressure built, that configuration started to tilt the odds. Because once you build networks that can move food, mates, and information faster than the environment can destroy them, you change the rules of population survival. You don't just cope with bad years, you compound advantages across generations. That's where we have to go next, into the math of small populations under pressure, and how in a fractured Ice Age Europe, even a modest edge in connectivity can, over thousands of years, decide who's still standing when the climate finally calms down. Imagine you're zoomed far enough out that individual lives blur into curves on a graph. No heroics, no tragic last stands, just birth rates, death rates, and whether a given lineage manages to replace itself or not. From that distance, the story in Ice Age Europe stops looking like who had the best spear and starts looking like compound interest. Because populations don't win by a lot most of the time, they win by a little very consistently. If one group over many generations averages just a tiny edge, a slightly higher chance that each child reaches adulthood or each adult survives to have a second or third child, that tiny edge starts to bend the curve. Think of two bands, both starting with 100 people. One averages 2 surviving children per woman, the other averages 2.1. In any single year, that difference is basically invisible. Someone had 1 extra healthy infant, someone else buried a toddler a week earlier. Life feels the same. Hunts, injuries, cold nights. But let that play out over 500 or 1,000 years, 20, 40 generations, and the math stops being invisible. The 2.0 population bumps along, growing a bit when years are good, shrinking when winters hit hard, sometimes crashing, sometimes recovering. The 2.1 population, meanwhile, very slowly pulls ahead. Each generation, a slightly larger cohort of teenagers, a slightly thicker cushion of reproductive age adults when a famine arrives, a slightly higher chance that some part of the network dodges the worst events. We don't have census records for Paleolithic Europe. We can't plug Neanderthal fertility and Homo sapiens juvenile mortality into an exact equation. But demographic models let us explore what would happen if, in a landscape as unstable as late Pleistocene Europe, one population was just a few % better at turning calories into surviving offspring. Everything we can see in the archaeological and genetic record is consistent with that kind of tiny, long-term tilt. And those new tools and networks we just talked about? They're exactly the sort of things that would create that slight tilt, not by making people invincible, but by changing how often bad luck becomes permanent loss. This is where group size starts to matter in a new way. It's not just more people means more hunters, it's more people means more memory. Anthropologists sometimes talk about a cultural carrying capacity of small groups. If you only have 20 or 30 adults, there's a hard ceiling on how many complex techniques, stories, and specialized roles you can keep in active use. If one elder dies, and they were the only person who knew the full ritual for stalking a particular prey in deep snow, that technique can vanish in a single flu season. If a small band is forced to split because of food shortages, each splinter may carry only a fraction of the group's knowledge. If one splinter dies out, their fraction is gone forever. The smaller and more isolated the group, the more the loss of a few key people can erase whole packages of skills. Once groups are large enough and connected enough, you start to cross thresholds where knowledge becomes resilient. Multiple people can hold the same skill. Apprentices can exist. If one camp burns, a cousin camp 3 valleys over still remembers how to make a particular hafting glue, or how to find a buried food cache under spring snow. Innovation is fragile when it's born in a tiny isolated group. It becomes robust when that group is part of a network big enough to copy, spread, and re-import ideas. That has 2 consequences for population math. First, it makes it more likely that successful subsistence strategies persist long enough to matter demographically. A clever new fishing technique doesn't just vanish with the person who thought of it. It becomes a regular part of the yearly plan, smoothing out bad years. Second, it makes pioneers more likely to stick. Early Homo sapiens entering Europe didn't have to be more curious or brave than earlier probes to make headway. They just had to be plugged into a wider web that could keep feeding them information, and occasional people from behind. Imagine again a small group pushing north out of the Near East into a new stretch of steppe forest. In earlier times, a similar-sized band, Neanderthal or Homo sapiens, might have tried the same thing. Some of these pushes probably worked for a generation or 2. Then a brutal winter, a series of bad hunts, or a conflict with neighbours could snuff them out. Their home bands might not even know exactly what happened. Word travels slowly and replacements are costly. The North Valley is dangerous becomes the remembered lesson. The frontier falls back, but picture that same edge band in a later, better connected world. There's still only 30 or 40 people on the ground. That doesn't feel like a wave of advance. It feels like watching the sky for omens and hoping your kids make it through the cold season. Yet they're not alone in the same way. They know a network of allied bands 2 or 3 weeks' travel behind them. They carry beads or marks that let them access hospitality in certain directions. They can send a few young hunters back to bring news and ask for help. They've heard, via gossip and spouses, about certain flint sources or salmon runs far ahead, because someone else's cousin went there last year. In that situation, the rate of pioneer failure doesn't have to drop dramatically to matter. If 10 out of 10 frontier bands used to blink out over a few generations, and now only 8 or 9 do, that's a huge shift in long-term expansion. Over centuries, that change turns occasional failed incursion into slow, ratcheting advance. You can see traces of this transition in the archaeological record, though they're fuzzy. In earlier periods, you find brief technocultural flares in parts of Europe, new tool styles or habits that appear for a while, then vanish from the record. They probably represent small populations pushing in, establishing themselves for a time, then being absorbed or disappearing. Later, after around 40,000 years ago, you start to see more continuity. Homo sapiens-associated industries, once established in a region, tend to persist, diversify, and spread rather than blink out. That doesn't mean every group survived. It doesn't mean there weren't setbacks, retreats, extinctions of local lineages. What it suggests is that, on average, the balance had tipped. Enough frontier groups were surviving long enough and getting enough reinforcement from behind that the overall wave of Homo sapiens presence in Europe stopped being episodic and started being sustained. This is the turning point in the population math. Once net replacement creeps above 1, once, on average, each band that vanishes is matched by a little more than one new band forming or splitting somewhere else, the shape of history changes. The newcomers stop being occasional visitors. They become a permanent feature of the landscape. Now it's important not to overstate what the math can tell us. We can run models where we tweak juvenile mortality by a few percentage points, or increase the rate of band fission as populations grow, or add in long-distance mating ties that reduce inbreeding. We can see how quickly those small changes can lead one population to gradually outnumber another, even if their individual capabilities are very similar. But we can't say Neanderthal childhood mortality was exactly X, Homo sapiens was exactly Y, therefore outcome Z was inevitable. The bones we have are a tiny sample. The radiocarbon dates are patchy. Climate reconstructions have error bars measured in centuries. Demographers can show that a modest advantage in survival and reproduction is sufficient to create the pattern we see. Homo sapiens populations expanding, Neanderthal ranges fragmenting and shrinking over thousands of years. They can't prove that this is the only way it could have happened, or that every local story followed the same script. What we can say is that once you build a system that turns slight advantages in flexibility, storage, and networking into slightly more surviving children, those advantages start to stack. More kids surviving means more potential innovators and more hands to carry traditions. More people in a network means more resilience against local disaster. More resilience means pioneers fail just a little less often, and each successful foothold makes it easier for the next. Feed that feedback loop into a Europe where climate keeps jerking the table beneath everyone, and you get a quiet revolution. Not a single battle that decided the fate of Neanderthals. Not a single genius invention that made them obsolete. A long overlapping process where one way of being human, more plugged into bigger networks, better at retaining and spreading innovations, slowly changes the demographic odds. Until, without anyone ever seeing a graph, the numbers have shifted so far that the old pattern of back-and-forth contact gives way to something else. Direct competition on a landscape that is running out of safe corners. Direct competition doesn't automatically mean Hollywood battle scenes. Most of the time, it looks like this. You show up somewhere hungry, and the best spots are already taken. Think about reindeer, horses, bison, whatever big game is moving through a valley in late autumn. The timing of those migrations isn't negotiable. The herds arrive when they arrive, move along certain ridgelines, cross particular rivers, funnel through passes they've used for generations. There are only so many places where a small group of humans can reliably intercept them. If a Neanderthal band has spent years mapping that migration, learning exactly where to wait, where to drive the animals, how to use the wind and terrain, that bottleneck in the landscape is a major asset. Now imagine a Homo sapiens group entering the same drainage basin. They might bring slightly different hunting tactics, more long-range projectiles, more elaborate drives, more intensive use of smaller game and fish to bridge lean times. They might also be plugged into a larger network that can keep them alive when a local plan fails. At first, both bands can coexist. The herds are large, the winters aren't at their worst, and there are enough good spots that awkward encounters can be spaced out in time and space. But climate in late Pleistocene Europe is not gentle. Glacial pulses, abrupt cold snaps, shifts in vegetation, all of these can squeeze the carrying capacity of a valley. In a lean year, the safe ambush sites where you can kill 2 or 3 big animals might be the difference between making it through winter and losing half your children. If the newcomers are better at coordinating multiple groups to hit a herd from different angles, or at tracking a wounded animal for miles across broken terrain, they might start intercepting more of that scarce prey before it reaches the Neanderthals' traditional kill zones. No one has to declare war for this to be catastrophic. You just have fewer carcasses to butcher. Your cache is empty sooner. You risk more dangerous hunts in bad conditions. Injuries don't heal because you're underfed. The next generation is smaller. That's competition via prey depletion, not necessarily driving animals extinct, but thinning them locally or diverting them into someone else's larder. The same logic applies to shelter. In Ice Age Europe, not all rock shelters and caves are equal. Some are dry, south-facing, near water and game trails. Others are damp, drafty, or flood-prone death traps. A good shelter isn't just about comfort. It's about survival during storms, safe places to raise infants, spots where you can safely store food and tools. Once Homo sapiens bands establish themselves in the best shelters along a river or ridge, they don't need to drive everyone else out of the entire region. They just have to occupy, more often than not, the handful of strategic places that buffer against the worst years. Neanderthal groups pushed into more marginal spots, higher up the slope, further from predictable water, with less room for storing meat, are forced into a thinner margin of safety. Over time, that kind of displacement shifts who can ride out the bad decades. And underneath all of this is territory. Not in the sense of nation-states with drawn borders, but in the sense of habitual ranges where you know every stream and rock over many generations. Neanderthals likely had strong mental and emotional maps of their valleys, just as Homo sapiens did elsewhere. These landscapes were filled with ancestors' stories, hunting memories, sacred spots. But territoriality in hunter-gatherers is often fuzzy at the edges. Boundaries may be negotiated seasonally, shared under certain conditions, or pushed outward when populations grow. When a new group moves into the same broad region, they don't have to conquer it overnight. They can start by using peripheral hunting grounds, by visiting rich salmon runs just for a season, by establishing seasonal camps along a river that used to be part of someone else's backup plan. If their numbers creep up faster, they can afford to keep coming back. If their networks reach further, they can afford a few bad years while they solidify their hold. Over centuries, what used to be overlapping, negotiable space starts to harden. A valley that was once part of a Neanderthal band's winter circuit might be occupied every year by Homo sapiens groups who leave their own hearths, their own caches, their own dead. The line between "we sometimes go there too" and "we used to go there before it became theirs" can shift slowly over many generations. None of this rules out violence. In fact, in a world where food and shelter are under pressure, it would be surprising if small-scale violence never happened. We have Neanderthal skeletons with healed and unhealed trauma, some of which could come from interpersonal conflict. We have modern human remains with similar marks. We have stone points embedded in bones, blunt force injuries to skulls, signs of face-to-face brutality that are hard to explain any other way. When bands that see each other as rivals, over hunting grounds, over access to flint sources, over potential mates, meet in a narrow pass, peace is not guaranteed. But localized violence is not the same thing as a continent-spanning war. Picture small-scale clashes, ambushes at a choke point, raids on a camp when most of the hunters are away, tense standoffs on a beach where two groups both want the same stranded whale. Some of these confrontations might end in bloodshed, with a few deaths altering the fates of families and stories. Others might be resolved by angry shouting, gift-giving, hostage exchange, or negotiated sharing. Over thousands of years and millions of square kilometers, those local dramas add up. but they don't organise themselves into a single campaign with a clear start and end date. What ties all these processes together is something demographers call diffusion and demographic swamping. Imagine again that Homo sapiens population curve rising just a bit faster than the Neanderthal curve. More sapiens births, slightly lower mortality, more fissioning of bands as they reach local carrying capacities and send daughter groups outward. Each daughter group pushing into the nearest available good terrain is a tiny bubble of ancestry. They might move into areas that are sparsely used. They might settle next to or intermix with Neanderthal communities. They might take over an abandoned shelter or create a new camp in a previously unused hollow. If, on average, Homo sapiens bands are forming more frequently than Neanderthal bands, their range expands like ink spreading through water. The expansion doesn't need to be violent at every point of contact. It can proceed by filling gaps, recolonizing areas where Neanderthal populations were temporarily knocked back by disease, by a local fire, by a patch of bad climate. Even if every individual mixed band feels like a normal, messy human community. The long-term statistical effect is that one genetic and cultural package is becoming more common in the landscape. That's demographic swamping. You don't exterminate every member of the other population. You just outnumber them, everywhere, more and more often, until encounters with you are more typical than encounters among themselves. Along the way, the boundary between us and them is not a hard line. Genetic evidence tells us that modern people of non-African ancestry carry Neanderthal DNA. Some populations in Asia and Oceania also carry Denisovan DNA. That means interbreeding wasn't rare freak events. It happened enough times, in enough places, that the genetic traces survived multiple population bottlenecks and expansions. Now imagine what that means on the ground. A Neanderthal woman, born into a shrinking local group, might be taken into a Homo sapiens band as a spouse, a captive, or an ally. Her children grow up with sapiens languages and myths, but they carry Neanderthal genes. A Homo sapiens hunter, isolated with a small mixed group for a winter, has children with a Neanderthal partner. Their descendants, generations later, may not even remember which ancestor came from which species label. In some regions, maybe especially where Neanderthals persisted longer and remained relatively numerous, such mixed communities could have been stable for centuries. Knowledge and techniques would also blend. A sapiens group might adopt a particularly effective Neanderthal hunting method for local mountain goats. A Neanderthal individual might learn to make a new kind of blade, or wear a certain kind of ornament common in sapiens networks. In those places, replacement looks less like one population vanishing overnight, and more like a gradual tilting of ancestry and culture inside mixed descendants. Elsewhere, the pattern could be very different. In some harsh northern refuges, Neanderthals might have hung on with little or no Homo sapiens presence for thousands of extra years, maintaining distinct tool traditions and ways of life until climate or internal demographic issues finally caught up. In other corridors, Homo sapiens might have spread quickly through regions where Neanderthal populations had already been thinned by previous climate shocks, leaving few opportunities for interbreeding simply because there were so few Neanderthals left to meet. In rugged terrains with complex microclimates, you could have a mosaic. One valley where Neanderthals remained dominant, another where sapiens had taken hold, a third where a mixed group served as a bridge between them. Over time, that patchwork would shift. Some Neanderthal pockets would be absorbed into expanding sapiens networks, their genes and some of their practices woven into a new tapestry. Other pockets might quietly disappear, leaving only hearth ash and a few scattered bones behind. When we talk about Neanderthals disappearing, then, we're compressing a messy, regionally varied, multi-thousand-year process into a single word. In some places, that disappearance probably looked like people literally being pushed out, driven from hunting grounds, losing key shelters, suffering more violence and stress. In other places, it may have looked like intermarriage, gradual cultural convergence, and the slow fading of distinct Neanderthal lineages into a broader, sapiens-dominated population. And in still others, it may have been driven largely by climate and chance, with Homo sapiens only later occupying lands where Neanderthals had already lost their hold. There's no single script that fits every cave and valley. What unites these stories is not a grand battle, but that steady demographic tilt we've been following. A background process that, once set in motion, made it harder and harder for small, fragmented Neanderthal populations to maintain themselves in a Europe that was not only changing climatically, but filling up with a different kind of human. Until, in the end, the last distinct Neanderthal groups were living on borrowed time. So where do we actually meet those last distinct Neanderthal groups? If you open a textbook, you'll usually see a simple ending. Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago, but that number is a statistical compromise, not a calendar date etched in stone. On the ground, it looks more like this. As Homo sapiens networks spread, Neanderthal populations fragment. Big, continuous ranges break into islands. Some vanish quickly. Others hang on in scattered refuges, peninsulas, mountain ranges, sheltered river systems, places that are just hard enough to reach, or just marginal enough, that demographic swamping takes longer. Southern Iberia, parts of the Italian peninsula, maybe pockets of the Balkans and the Caucasus. These are the kinds of landscapes that show up again and again in the debate over the last Neanderthals. They're not empty wildernesses. They're complicated patchworks of rocky coastlines, steep hills, microclimates, places where an experienced group can eke out a living on shellfish, small game, seasonal herds, and plant foods that strangers might overlook. If you're a shrinking Neanderthal population, that's both a blessing and a trap. The blessing is obvious. The very features that make these regions annoying for large-scale human expansions, broken terrain, limited big game routes, awkward access, also slow the demographic tide. You can avoid direct competition a little longer. You can keep using familiar caves and hunting grounds. While the rest of the continent shifts, the trap is subtler. Those same conditions often cap your numbers. You can't easily expand, split and send off daughter bands. You're living on the ecological equivalent of a narrow ledge. 1 or 2 bad decades, a disease outbreak, a run of poor winters, and your already small population tips below the level where it can reliably replace itself. From our perspective, tens of thousands of years later, these final refugees show up as a handful of archaeological sites with late dates. Caves like Gorham's in Gibraltar, shelters in southern Spain, some sites in Italy, or the Caucasus that seem to preserve Neanderthal occupation when they've vanished elsewhere. But even saying late dates hides a huge problem. Pinning down the last Neanderthals is one of the hardest tasks in Pleistocene archaeology. First, because we almost never have enough sites. The archaeological record is a lottery ticket system. Most of what ever existed has been destroyed, buried beyond reach, or is sitting unexcavated under modern towns, forests and farmland. The odds that the actual last Neanderthal camp just happens to be one of the few caves we've dug are vanishingly small. Second, because dating methods are not magic. Radiocarbon dating, the workhorse for this period, depends on tiny traces of radioactive carbon in organic material. Those traces decay over time. By around 50,000 years ago, there's so little left that small contaminants, tiny intrusions of younger material, or subtle chemical changes can throw the numbers off by thousands of years. On top of that, cave sediments are not neat layer cakes. Rodents burrow, roots grow, water seeps. A burnt bone from a later hearth can trickle down into an older layer. Bits of older charcoal can be dragged up by digging animals and mixed into younger deposits. So when archaeologists say, this looks like a terminal Neanderthal occupation, this might be one of the last groups in this region, they're not just pointing at a date, they're evaluating a whole package: stratigraphy, stone tools, faunal remains, the condition of the bones, the chemistry of the sediments, the distribution of artifacts. A single new radiocarbon measurement from a cleaner sample, or a new method for removing contamination, can shift the timeline of a site by thousands of years. This is why you sometimes see headlines like, Neanderthals survived 3,000 years longer than we thought, followed a few years later by, reanalysis shows Neanderthals disappeared earlier than expected. We are constantly recalibrating. And then there's another layer of complication. Even if you know the age of a layer, how do you know who made the tools in it? For most of the Neanderthal timeline, this isn't too hard. Neanderthals are associated with certain stone tool traditions, especially the Middle Paleolithic industries like the Mousterian in Europe. Homo sapiens in later periods tend to be linked to Upper Paleolithic industries with more blades, bone tools, and ornaments. But at the boundary where these populations overlap, everything gets messy. There are sites where what looks like a classic Neanderthal toolkit suddenly appears alongside ornaments, pigments, or bone tools that look more like Homo sapiens behaviour. There are industries, like the Châtel-Perronian in France and northern Spain, that sit right on this frontier, technically sophisticated, with some elements of Upper Paleolithic style found in context with Neanderthal remains. Did Neanderthals invent these new technologies themselves, independently, as their world changed? Did they copy or adapt ideas picked up through contact with Homo sapiens' neighbours? Or are we misreading the context, assigning tools to the wrong makers because bones and artifacts from slightly different times ended up mixed together? Different researchers give different weight to these possibilities. Some see the late Neanderthal record as evidence of a Neanderthal renaissance, with groups in contact zones rapidly innovating, experimenting with ornaments, pigments, perhaps more complex symbolic behaviours. Others argue that at least some of these seeming innovations are mirages created by disturbed deposits, or by Homo sapiens briefly using the same caves later. Even the most cautious interpretations, though, suggest that the boundary period was not static. It wasn't Neanderthals doing the exact same thing for 200,000 years and then disappearing overnight. It was a dynamic, culturally active moment where ideas and techniques were flowing in multiple directions. And that raises an uncomfortable but important point. When we talk about who made which tools, we're trying to draw clean lines across what may have been very tangled mixed communities. In regions of long coexistence and interbreeding, a Neanderthal camp might include people with varied ancestry, using a blend of local traditions and imported tricks. The same goes for neighbouring Homo sapiens groups. Our labels, Mousterian, Aurignacian, Châtelperronian, are modern attempts to categorise patterns in stone. They do not map neatly onto the messy, lived identities of Ice Age people. So when did the last unambiguously Neanderthal group pack up its last campfire and never come back? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we may never know. We can bracket the rough window. In most of Europe, distinctive Neanderthal-associated industries fade out between about 45,000 and 39,000 years ago. In a few southern refuges, some researchers argue for survival a little later. Others contest those claims on dating grounds. But the idea that we can point to a cave and say, this is where the last Neanderthal died on a Tuesday is fantasy. Extinction at this scale is not a single event. It's a process that plays out across thousands of miles and many generations. What we can say, with more confidence, is that Neanderthals did not leave the stage empty-handed. Part of what remains is written in us. If you have ancestry from outside Africa, 1 to a few % of your DNA likely traces back to Neanderthal ancestors. Those fragments are not evenly distributed. Some influence skin and hair traits, some affect immune responses, some are linked to how we process fats, or respond to altitude, or handle certain pathogens. Over the last decade, geneticists have found Neanderthal-derived variants that seem to help with resistance to specific diseases, or with living in colder climates. Others may increase risk for modern conditions like depression or nicotine addiction. Not because Neanderthals were predisposed to those things, but because genes tuned for Ice Age life interact in strange ways with modern environments. These bits of DNA are not Neanderthal ghosts. They're part of the toolkit that let our ancestors survive as they moved into new landscapes. In that sense, Neanderthal populations contributed directly to the success of later humans, even as their own distinct lineages dwindled. But genes are only part of the inheritance. Some of the knowledge that flowed across contact zones, hunting strategies, ways of using particular plants, techniques for working bone or stone in certain environments, may also have had Neanderthal origins, then been absorbed and reworked inside Homo sapiens networks. It's almost impossible to trace that archaeologically in a clean, one-to-one way. Technologies rarely come with engraved labels announcing their creators. But cultural borrowing is the rule, not the exception whenever human groups meet. There's no reason to think our species boundary somehow blocked that. So what remains of the last Neanderthals? Scattered bones in caves and rock shelters? Yes. Stone tools lying where they fell from numb-gloved hands, fire-blackened ceilings, DNA threads hiding in our chromosomes, but also a question that refuses to go away. Because when you put all the evidence together, the Neanderthal story does not look like a sudden defeat on a battlefield. It looks like a changing world, climates lurching, ecosystems reshuffling, a new kind of human slowly spreading through the same landscapes, bringing slightly different social structures, slightly faster population growth, slightly more flexible networks. In that world, even a highly adapted, intelligent, culturally sophisticated species can find itself squeezed into smaller and smaller corners, buffeted by bad luck and bad decades, gradually losing the demographic race. Did Neanderthals lose to us? Or did they, in some sense, become part of us, absorbed genetically and perhaps culturally into a wider, more rapidly expanding human story, at the same time that their distinct way of life became impossible to maintain? That ambiguity is the central mystery they leave behind, and to understand what changed and why it mattered so much, we have to look not just at Neanderthals, but at what was happening inside our own lineage at the very same moment. So what actually tipped the balance? When you line up the evidence, you don't see a single magic bullet. You see several slow, grinding forces all pushing in roughly the same direction, and Neanderthals standing in exactly the wrong place when they all aligned. One big piece is climate. The world Neanderthals mastered was not just cold, it was violently unstable. Over and over, ice cores and sea sediments show sharp swings, sudden freezes, abrupt warm spikes, regional droughts, forests flipping to open steppe and back again within a few centuries. Neanderthals were very good at living in particular versions of that world, cold, seasonal, rich in big game. They were built for short, powerful bursts of effort, close-range hunting, intensive use of familiar territories. But the last 100,000 years before they disappear are especially chaotic. Habitat mosaics keep rearranging, herd routes shift, productive patches blink in and out. For a specialist adapted to a certain set of rhythms, that doesn't just mean harder hunting. It means more frequent local crashes, more periods where small, isolated groups get knocked below replacement. At the same time, something different is happening inside our own lineage. This is where demography and networks come in. Every line of evidence we have, from genetics, from site counts, from the spread of tool traditions, points to Homo sapiens running a different social experiment. Our bands were still small, but they seem to have been stitched together into wider, more flexible networks. Artifacts and raw materials move over longer distances. Tool styles standardize across huge regions. Symbolic ornaments and pigments appear in clusters that stretch far beyond what a single valley group could produce. That isn't just culture, it's infrastructure. If your group gets hit by a bad winter, a disease outbreak, or a run of failed hunts, having partners 100, 200, 300 kilometers away matters. You can send people out. You can marry in. You can plug into other people's food, information, and labor. Demographically, that does two crucial things. First, it buffers local crashes. A Neanderthal band stuck on an ecological ledge with no tight links beyond its neighboring valleys is more likely to wink out for good when things go wrong. A Homo sapiens band that's one node in a sprawling exchange web is more likely to be rescued, replenished, or absorbed. Second, it allows faster growth. If your social rules encourage wider mate exchange, if your knowledge-sharing systems spread innovations quickly, if your group boundaries are porous enough that people and ideas can flow, then any small advantage, slightly better infant survival, slightly higher hunting efficiency, slightly broader diet, compounds across the network. That's what the genetic data seem to show. As sapiens spread into Eurasia, effective population sizes ramp up. Neanderthal numbers, already low and fragmented, don't. This doesn't require us to imagine some huge cognitive gulf or superhero-level intelligence difference. It's enough to give one population slightly more flexible social structures and slightly more scalable cooperation, and then let time and climate instability do the rest. Competition sits on top of all of this. Once Homo sapiens bands and Neanderthal bands are using overlapping territories, hunting some of the same herds, targeting the same water sources and winter shelters, any demographic edge becomes a pressure. You don't need constant warfare to drive replacement. You just need one population whose numbers rebound more quickly after every bad decade, who can split and send off daughter groups more often, who fill in the gaps faster whenever climate or chance opens a hole. Sometimes contact would have been violent, raids, killings, territorial disputes. Sometimes it would have been intimate, interbreeding, shared tools, borrowed techniques. Often it was probably just tense parallel use of the same landscapes, each group watching the other from the ridgelines. Over thousands of years, that kind of asymmetric coexistence adds up. Neanderthal ranges fray, sapiens ranges thicken. The same mixed encounters that pass Neanderthal DNA into our lineage also dilute and eventually erase Neanderthal demography. So which factor did it? If you pushed most researchers to rank them today, many would put demography and networks near the top. Small, vulnerable Neanderthal populations running out of room in a world where a more numerous, more connected population keeps showing up in the same places. Climate instability and habitat change are the background engine making every population's life harder, amplifying the cost of being small and isolated. Direct competition, whether for carcasses, caves, or mates, accelerates the process, but probably isn't a single final battle. It's more like a long, uneven squeeze, and yet we have to be honest. We are still guessing in important ways. We don't have a year-by-year census of Neanderthal and sapiens numbers. We have patchy sites, broken bones, scattered tools, and genetic patterns reconstructed from a handful of ancient individuals. We don't know exactly how Neanderthals organized their alliances, how far their trade links reached, how their kinship rules worked. It's entirely possible that future finds will nudge the balance, showing, for example, that Neanderthal networks were wider than we think, or that particular climate events were even more devastating than current models suggest. What we can say with some confidence is that the turning point wasn't just about brains or brawn. It was about how you plug brains and brawn into a social system. Adaptation here is not only biological, it's social and demographic. It's about building networks that can carry information, genes, and resources across distance and time. It's about creating cultures that scale. In that sense, the Neanderthal story isn't just a mystery about the past. It's a mirror held up to us. We are the descendants of the population that bet everything on connectivity, on rapid information flow, on big, flexible social webs. That gamble worked spectacularly, for us. But it also came with costs for every other human species we met. So what do you think was the real tipping point? Was it the climate chaos that kept resetting the board, the sheer demographic weight of a more rapidly expanding species, the power of wider social networks and long-distance alliances, or something we still haven't fully imagined? I'd love to hear your take. Let me know in the comments what you think mattered most, and where in the world you're listening from as you think about Ice Age Europe and its lost people. If you've enjoyed this journey into deep time, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves big, strange stories about where we came from. It really does help more people find this kind of content. And if you want to go even deeper into the hidden chapters of our species' story, the bottlenecks, the vanished cousins, the buried clues, we've put together a whole book of prehistoric secrets. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. Because the more we learn about how fragile and how resilient our past really was, the better we can understand the strange, precarious moment we're living through now.